Chapter 4 of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Barbara engages counsel. Bidding a hasty good morning to the elevator girl, Harry Kent, suitcase in hand, entered the cage and was carried up to the 4th floor of the Wilkins building. Several business acquaintances stopped to chat with him as he walked down the corridor to his office, and it was fully 15 minutes before he turned the knob of the door bearing the firm name, Rochester and Kent Attorneys, on its glass panel. As he stepped inside the anteroom which separated the two offices occupied respectively by him and his senior partner, Philip Rochester, a stranger rose from the clerk's desk. "Yes, sir?" he asked interrogatively. Kent eyed him in surprise. "Mr. Rochester here?" he inquired. "No, sir. I am in charge of the office." "You are?" Kent's surprise increased. "I happen to be Mr. Kent, junior partner in this firm." "I beg your pardon, sir." The dapper clerk bowed and, hurrying to his desk, took up a letter. "Mr. Rochester left this for you, Mr. Kent, before his departure last night." "His departure?" Kent deposited his suitcase on one of the chairs and tore open the envelope. The note was a scrawl, which he had some difficulty in deciphering. "Dear Kent," it ran, "am called out of town. Will be back Saturday. Saunders gave me some of his cheek this afternoon, so I fired him. I engaged John Sylvester to fill his place, who comes highly recommended. He will report for work tomorrow. Ta-ta, Phil." Kent thrust the note into his pocket and picked up his suitcase. "Mr. Rochester says that he has engaged you," he said. "Your references?" "Here, sir." The clerk handed him a folded paper, and Kent ran his eyes down the sheet from the sentence, "To whom it may concern," to the signature, "Clark Hildebrand." The statement spoke, in high terms, of John Sylvester, confidential clerk. "I can refer you to my other employers, Mr. Kent," Sylvester volunteered, as the young lawyer stood regarding the paper. "If you desire further information, there is Mr. Clymer and—" "No, Judge Hildebrand's recommendation is sufficient," and at Kent's smile the clerk's anxious expression vanished. "Did Mr. Rochester give you any outline of the work?" "Yes, sir. He told me to file the papers in the Hitchcock case and attend to the morning correspondence." "Very good. Has anyone called this morning?" "No, sir. These letters were addressed to you personally, and I have not opened them." Sylvester handed a neatly arranged packet to Kent. "These," indicating several letters lying open on his desk, "are to the firm." "Bring them to me in half an hour," and Kent walked into his private office, carefully closing the door behind him. Opening his suitcase, he took out his brief bag and laid it on the desk in front of him, together with the package of letters. Instead of opening the letters immediately, he tilted back in his chair and regarded the opposite wall in deep thought. Philip Rochester could not have selected a worse time to absent himself. 3 important cases were on the calendar for immediate trial, and much depended on the firm's successful handling of them. Kent swore softly under his breath. His last warning to Rochester, that he would dissolve their partnership if the older man continued to neglect his practice, had been given only a month before, and upon Kent's return from 8 months' service in the Judge Advocate General's department in France. Apparently his warning had fallen on deaf ears, and Rochester was indulging in another periodic spree, for so Kent concluded, recalling the unsteady penmanship of the note handed to him by the new clerk, John Sylvester. Kent was still frowning at the opposite wall when a faint knock sounded, and at his call Sylvester entered. "Here are the letters received this morning, sir, and typewritten copies of the answers to yesterday's correspondence which Mr. Rochester dictated before leaving." Sylvester explained as he placed the papers on Kent's desk. "If you will okay them, I will mail them at once." Kent went through the letters with care, and the new clerk rose in his estimation as he read the excellent dictation of the clearly typed letters. "These will do admirably," he announced. "Sit down and I will reply to the other letters." At the end of an hour Sylvester closed his stenographic notebook and collected the correspondence, by that time scattered over Kent's desk. "I'll have these notes ready for your signature before lunch," he said as he picked up a newspaper from the floor where it had tumbled during Kent's search for some particular letterheads. "I brought in the morning paper, sir. Thought perhaps you had not seen it." "Thanks." Kent swung his chair nearer the window and opened the newspaper. He had purchased a copy when walking through Union Station on his arrival, but had left it in the cafeteria where he had snatched a cup of coffee and hot rolls before hurrying to his office. He read a column devoted to international affairs, scanned an account of a senatorial wrangle, and was about to turn to the second page, whistling cheerily, when his attention was arrested by the headings, Bank Cashier Dies in Police Court, James Turnbull, mistaken for burglar, suffers fatal attack of angina pectoris. Kent's whistle stopped abruptly, and clutching the paper in both hands, he devoured the short account printed under the scareheads. While masquerading as a burglar on a wager, James Turnbull, cashier of the Metropolis Trust Company, was arrested by Officer O'Ryan at an early hour yesterday morning in the residence of Colonel Charles McIntyre. Officer O'Ryan conducted his prisoner to the 8th Precinct Police Station, and later he was arraigned in the police court. The Mrs. McIntyre appeared in person to prefer the charges against the supposed burglar, who, on being sworn, gave the name of John Smith. Philip Rochester, the well-known criminal lawyer, was assigned by the court to defend the prisoner. Upon the evidence submitted, Judge Mackle held the prisoner for trial by the grand jury. It was just after the judge's announcement that John Smith, then sitting in the prisoner's cage, was seized with the attack of angina pectoris, which ended so fatally a few minutes later. It was not until after he had expired that those rendering him medical assistance became aware that he was James Turnbull in disguise. James Turnbull was a native of Washington, his father, the late Honorable Josiah Turnbull of Connecticut, having made this city his permanent home in the early 90s. Mr. Turnbull was looked upon as one of the rising young men in banking circles. He was also prominent socially, and was a member of the Alibi, Metropolitan, and Country Clubs, and until recently was active in all forms of athletics when his ill health precluded active exercise. Officer O'Ryan, who was greatly shocked by the fatal termination to Mr. Turnbull's rash wager, stated to the representatives of the press that Mr. Turnbull gave no hint of his identity while being interrogated at the 8th Precinct Station. Friends attribute Mr. Turnbull's disinclination to reveal himself to the court to his enjoyment of a practical joke, not realizing that the resultant excitement of the scene would react on his weak heart. Mr. Turnbull is survived by a great aunt. He had no nearer relatives living. It is a singular coincidence that the lawyer appointed by the court to defend Turnbull was his intimate friend, Philip Rochester, who made his home with the deceased. Kent read the column over and over, then letting the paper slip to the floor, sat back in his chair, too dumbfounded for words. Jimmy Turnbull arrested as a burglar in the home of the girl he loved, on charges preferred by her, and defended in court by his intimate friend, both of whom were unaware of his identity? Kent rumpled his fair hair until it stood upright, and Jimmy's death had followed almost immediately as the result of over-excitement. Kent's eyes grew moist. He had been very fond of the eccentric, lovable bank cashier, whose knack of performing many a kindly act, unsolicited, had endeared him to friends and acquaintances alike. Kent had seen much of him after his return from France, for Jimmy's attention to Helen McIntyre had been only second to Kent's devotion to the latter's sister, Barbara. The two men had one bond in common. Colonel McIntyre disliked them and discouraged their calling, to the secret fury of both. But love had found a way. Kent's eyes kindled at the recollection of Barbara's half-shy, wholly tender reception of his ardent pleading. Turnbull's courtship had met with a setback when he had least expected it. Philip Rochester had fallen deeply in love with Helen, and, encouraged by her father, had pressed his suit with ardor. Frequent quarrels between the two close friends had been the outcome, and Jimmy had confided to Kent, before the latter left on the business trip to Chicago from which he had returned that morning, that the situation had become intolerable, and he had notified Rochester that he would no longer share his apartment with him, and to look for other quarters as quickly as possible. So buried was Kent in his thoughts that he never heard Sylvester's knock, and it was not until the clerk stood at his elbow that he awoke from his absorption. "A lady to see you, Mr. Kent," he announced. "Shall I show her in?" "Certainly. Her name?" "She gave none." Sylvester paused on his way back to the door. "It is one of the Misses McIntyre." "Good Lord!" Kent was on his feet, straightening his tie and brushing his rumpled hair. "Here, wait a minute," clutching a whisk broom in a frantic endeavor to remove some of the signs of travel which still clung to him. But he had only opportunity for one dab at his left shoulder before Barbara entered the office. All else forgotten, Kent tossed down the whisk broom, and the next instant he had clasped her hand in both of his eyes telling more eloquently than his stumbling words his joy at seeing her again. "This is a business call," she stated demurely, "on you and Mr. Rochester." Her lovely eyes held a glint of mischief as she mentioned Kent's partner. Then her expression grew serious. "I want legal advice." "I am afraid you'll have to put up with me." Kent moved his chair closer to the one she had selected by the desk. "Rochester is out of town." "What?" Barbara sat bolt upright. Where has he gone?" "I don't know." Kent pulled Rochester's letter out of his pocket and reread it. "He did not mention where he was going." Barbara stared at him. She had paled. "When did Philip leave?" "Last night, I presume." Kent tipped back his chair and pressed a buzzer. A second later Sylvester appeared in the doorway. "Did Mr. Rochester tell you where he was going?" he asked the clerk. "No, sir. Mr. Rochester stated that you had his address." "I?" Kent concealed his growing surprise. "Did he leave any message for me other than the letter?" "No, sir." "At what hour did he leave the office?" "I can't say, sir. He was still here when I went away at 5 o'clock. He gave me a key to the office so that I could get in this morning." Kent remained silent, and he added, "Is that all, sir?" "Yes, thanks." And the clerk retired. As the door closed, Barbara turned to Kent. "Have you heard about Jimmie Turnbull?" Her voice was a bit breathless as she put the question, but Kent, puzzling over his partner's eccentric conduct, hardly noted her agitation. "Yes, I saw the account just now in the morning paper," he answered. "A shocking affair. Poor Turnbull. He was a good fellow." "He was!" Barbara spoke with unaccustomed vehemence, and looking at her Kent saw that her eyes were filled with tears. Impulsively he threw his arm about her, holding her close. "My heart's dearest," he murmured fondly. "If there is anything I can do." Barbara straightened up and winked away the tears. "There is," she said tersely. "Investigate Jimmie's death." Kent gazed at her in astonishment. "Please explain," he suggested. "The morning paper states very plainly that the cause of death was an attack of angina pectoris." "Yes, I know, and that is what Philip Rochester contends also." Barbara paused and glanced about the office. They had the room to themselves. But Helen believes otherwise." Kent drew back. "What do you mean, Babs?" he demanded. "Just that." Barbara spoke wearily, and Kent, giving her close attention, grew aware of dark shadows under her eyes which told plainly of a sleepless night. "I want to engage you as our counsel to help Helen find out about Jimmie's death." "Find out what?" asked Kent, his bewilderment increasing. "Do you mean that Jimmie's death was not the result of a dangerous heart disease, but of foul play?" Barbara nodded her head vigorously. "Yes." Kent sat back in his chair and regarded her in silence for a second. "How could that be, Babs, in an open police court with dozens of spectators all about?" he asked. "The slightest attempt to kill him would have been frustrated by the police officials. Remember, a prisoner especially is hedged in and guarded." "Well, he wasn't so very hedged in," retorted Barbara. "I was there and saw how closely people approached Jimmie." "Did you observe anyone hand him anything?" "No." Barbara drawled the word as she strove to visualize the scene in the courtroom. Then, catching Kent's look of doubt, she added with unmistakable emphasis, "Helen and I do not believe that Jimmie died from natural causes. We think the tragedy should be investigated." Her soft voice deepened. "I must know the truth, Harry dear, for I feel that perhaps I am responsible for Jimmie's death." "You?" Kent's voice rose in indignant protest. "Absurd!" "No, it isn't. If it hadn't been for my wager with Jimmie, he never would have entered our house disguised as a burglar." "What brought about the wager?" "Last Sunday Helen was boasting of her 2 new police dogs, which Philip Rochester recently gave her, and said how safe she felt. We'd had several burglaries in our neighborhood," Barbara explained, "and when Jimmie scoffed at the dogs, I bet him that he could not break into the house without the dogs arousing the household. I never once thought about Jimmie's heart trouble," she confessed, and her lips quivered. "I feel so guilty." "You are inconsistent, Babs," chided Kent gently. "One moment you reproach yourself for being the cause of bringing on Jimmie's heart attack, and the next you declare you believe he died through foul play. You," looking at her tenderly, while a whimsical smile softened his stern mouth, "don't go so far as to claim you murdered him, do you?" "Of course I didn't." Barbara spoke with indignant emphasis, and her fingers snapped in uncontrollable nervousness. "Jimmie was very dear," she hesitated, "to us. Neither Helen nor I can leave a stone unturned until we know without a shadow of a doubt what killed him." "That is easily proven," declared Kent. "An autopsy—" "Helen asked the coroner to hold one." Kent stared. The twins were certainly in earnest. "My advice to you is to wait until you hear the result of the post-mortem from Coroner Penfield," he said gravely. "Until we know definitely what killed Jimmy, speculation is idle." Barbara rose at once. "I thought you would be more sympathetic," she remarked, and her voice was a bit unsteady. "I am sorry to have troubled you." In an instant Kent was by her side. "Barbara," he entreated, "I promise solemnly to aid you in every possible way. My only happiness is in serving you." His voice was very tender. "I slave here, day in and day out, that I may sometime be able to make a home for you. Don't leave me in anger." "I was not angry, only deeply hurt," Barbara confessed. "I have so longed to see you. I needed you. The rest was lost as she bowed her head against Kent's broad shoulder, and his impassioned whispers of devotion brought solace to her troubled spirit. "I must go," declared Barbara 10 minutes later. "Father would make a fearful scene if he knew I had been here to see you." She picked up her handbag, preparatory to leaving. "Then I can tell Helen that you will aid us?" "Yes." Kent stopped on his way to the door. "I will try and see the coroner this afternoon. In the meantime, Babs, can't you tell me what makes you suspect that Jimmy might have been killed?" "I have nothing tangible to go on," she admitted. "Only a woman's instinct." Kent did not smile. "Instinct," he repeated thoughtfully. "Well, does your instinct hazard a guess as to the weapon, the opportunity and the motive for such a crime? Jimmy Turnbull hadn't an enemy in the world." Barbara looked at him oddly. "Suppose you find the answer to those conundrums," she suggested. "Don't come to the elevator. Margaret Brewster may see you with me, and she would tell father of our meeting." "Is Mrs. Brewster still with you?" asked Kent, paying no attention to her protest as he accompanied her down the corridor. "I understood she planned to return to the West last week." "She did, but father persuaded her to prolong her visit." Barbara was guilty of a grimace. Then hailing the descending elevator, she bolted into it and waved her goodbye to Kent as the cage shot downward. When Kent re-entered his office, he found Sylvester hanging up the telephone receiver. "Mr. Clymer has telephoned to ask if you will come to the Metropolis Trust Company at once," he said, and before Kent could frame a reply, he had darted into the coat closet and brought out his hat and cane and handed them to him. "Don't wait for me, but go out for your luncheon," directed Kent, observing the hour. "I have my key and can get in when I return if you should not be here." And not waiting to hear Sylvester's thanks, he hurried away. The clock over the bank had just struck noon when Kent reached the fine office building which housed the Metropolis Trust Company, and as he entered the bank a messenger stopped him. "Mr. Clymer is waiting for you in his private office, sir," he said, and led the way past the long rows of mahogany counters and plate glass windows to the back of the bank, finally stopping before a door bearing the name, in modest lettering, Benjamin Augustus Clymer. The bank president was sensitive on one point. He never permitted initials only to be used before his name. The messenger's deferential knock was answered by a gruff command to enter. Clymer welcomed Kent with an air of relief. "You know Colonel McIntyre," he said by way of introduction, and Kent became aware that the tall man lounging with his back to him in one of the leather-covered chairs was Barbara's father. Colonel McIntyre returned Kent's bow with a curt nod, and then Clymer pushed forward a chair. "Sit down, Kent," he began. "You have already handled several confidential affairs for the bank in a satisfactory manner, and I have sent for you to-day to ask your aid in an urgent matter. Before I go further, I must ask you to treat what I am about to say as strictly confidential." "Certainly, Mr. Clymer." "Good. Then draw up your chair." Clymer waited until Kent had complied with his request. "You have heard of Jimmy Turnbull's sudden and tragic death?" "Yes." "As you know, he was cashier of this bank." Clymer spoke with deliberation. "Soon after word reached here of his death, the vice president and treasurer of the bank had a careful examination made of his books and accounts." Clymer paused to clear his throat. He was troubled with an irritating cough. "Turnbull's accounts were found in first-class order." "I am sure they would be, Mr. Clymer," exclaimed Kent warmly. "Anyone who knew Jimmy would never doubt his honesty. McIntyre turned in his chair and regarded the speaker with no friendly eye, but aside from that took no part in the conversation. Clymer did not at once resume speaking. "Today," he commenced finally, "Colonel McIntyre called at the bank and asked the treasurer, Mr. Gilmore, for certain valuable negotiable securities which he left in the bank's care a month ago. Mr. Gilmore told Colonel McIntyre that these securities had been given to Jimmie Turnbull last Saturday, on his presentation of a letter from McIntyre requesting that they be turned over to the bank's cashier. McIntyre expressed his surprise and asked to see the letter." Clymer paused and took a paper from his desk. "Here is the letter." Kent took the paper and examined it closely. "This is perfectly in order," he said. "A clear statement in Colonel McIntyre's handwriting and on his stationery." For the first time Colonel McIntyre addressed him. "The letter is in order," he acknowledged, "and written on my stationery. But it was not written by me. The letter is a clever forgery." End of chapter 4. Chapter 6 of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Straight questions and crooked answers. Colonel McIntyre, with an angry gesture, threw down the newspaper he had been reading. "Do you mean to say, Helen, that you decline to go to the supper tonight on account of the death of Jimmie Turnbull?" he asked. "Yes, father." McIntyre flushed a dark red. He was not accustomed to scenes with either of his daughters, and here was Helen flouting his authority, and Barbara backing her up. "It is quite time this pretense is dropped," he remarked stiffly. "You were not engaged to Jimmie. Wait," as she attempted to interrupt him. "You told me the night of the burglary that he was nothing to you." "I was mistaken." Helen's voice shook as she was very near to tears. "When I saw Jimmie lying there, dead," she faltered, and her shoulders drooped forlornly, "the world stopped for me." "Hysterical nonsense!" McIntyre was careful to avoid Barbara's eyes. Her indignant snort had been indicative of her feelings. "Keep to your room, Helen, until you regain some common sense. It is as well our friend should not see you in your present frame of mind." Helen regarded her father under lowered lids. "Very well," she said submissively, and walked toward the door. On reaching it she paused, and spoke over her shoulder. "Don't try me too far, father." McIntyre stared for a full minute at the doorway through which Helen took her departure. "Well, what the—" He pulled himself up short in the middle of the ejaculation and turned to Barbara. "Go and get dressed," he directed. "We must leave here in 20 minutes." "I am not going," she announced. "Not going?" McIntyre frowned, then laughed abruptly. "Now don't tell me you were engaged to Jimmie Turnbull also." "I think you are horrid." Barbara's small foot came down with a vigorous stamp. "Well, perhaps I am," her father admitted rather wearily. "Don't keep us waiting, Babs. The car will be here in less than 20 minutes." "But, father, I prefer to stay at home." "And I prefer to have you accompany us," retorted McIntyre. "Come, Barbara. We cannot be discourteous to Mrs. Brewster. She is our guest, and this supper is for her entertainment." "Well, take her." Barbara was openly rebellious. "Barbara!" His tone caused her to look at him in wonder. Instead of the stern rebuke she expected, his voice was almost wheedling. "I cannot very well take Mrs. Brewster to a café at this hour without causing gossip." "Oh, fiddlesticks!" exclaimed Barbara. "I don't have to play chaperone for you two. Everyone knows she is visiting us. What's there improper in your taking her out to supper? Why," regarding him critically, "she's young enough to be your daughter." "Go to your room." There was nothing wheedling about McIntyre at that instant. He was thoroughly incensed. As Barbara spread out, happy in having gained her way, she announced, as a parting shot, "If you can be nasty to Helen, father, I can be nasty too." Colonel McIntyre brought his fist down on a smoking table with such force that he scattered its contents over the floor. When he rose from picking up the debris, he found Mrs. Brewster at his elbow. "Can I help?" she asked. "No, thanks. Everything is back in place." He pulled forward a chair for her. "If agreeable to you, I will telephone Ben Clymer that we will stop for him and take us with us to the Café St. Mark's. Or would you prefer some other man?" "Oh, no." She threw her evening wrap across the sofa and sat down. "Are the girls ready?"
They are indisposed and won't be able to go tonight."
"What? Both girls?"
"Yes, both," firmly, not however meeting her eyes.
"Hadn't I better stay with them?" she asked. "Have you telephoned to Dr. Stone?"
"There's no necessity of giving up our little spree," he declared cheerily. "The girls don't need a physician. They," with meaning, "need a mother's care."
He picked up her coronation scarf from the floor where it had slipped and laid it across her bare shoulders. The action was almost a caress. She made a lovely picture as she sat in the high-backed carved chair in her chic evening gown, and as her soft dark eyes met his ardent look, McIntyre felt the hot blood surge to his temples, and with quickened pulse he went to the telephone stand and gave Central a number. Back in her chair, Mrs. Brewster sat thoughtfully watching him. She had been an unobserved witness of the scene with Barbara, having entered the library in time to hear the girls' last remarks. It was not the first inkling that she had had of their disapproval of Colonel McIntyre's attentions to her, but it had hurt. The widow had become acquainted with the twins when traveling in Europe just before the outbreak of the World War, and had made the hasty trip back to this country in their company. Colonel McIntyre had planned to bring the twins, then at school in Paris, home himself, but business had kept him in the West, and he had cabled to a spinster cousin to chaperone them on the trip across the Atlantic Ocean. Nor had he reached New York in time to see them disembark, and thus had missed meeting Mrs. Brewster, then in her first year of widowhood. The friendship between the twins and Mrs. Brewster had been kept up through much correspondence, and the widow had finally promised to come to Washington for their debut, visiting her cousins, Dr. and Mrs. Stone. The meeting had but cemented the friendship between them, and at the twins' urgent request, seconded with warmth by Colonel McIntyre, she had promised to spend the month of April at the McIntyre home. The visit was nearly over. Mrs. Brewster sighed faintly. There were two courses open to her: immediate departure, or to continue to ignore the twins' strangely antagonistic behavior. The first course did not suit Mrs. Brewster's plans. Barbara, who had left the library through one of its 7 doors, had failed to see Mrs. Brewster by the slightest margin. She was intent only on being with Helen. The affection between the twins was very close, but while their facial resemblance was remarkable, their natures were totally dissimilar. Helen, the elder by 20 minutes, was studious, shy, and too much given to introspection. Barbara, on the contrary, was whimsical and practical by turns, with a great capacity for enjoyment. The twins had made their debut jointly on their 18th birthday, and while both were popular, Barbara had received the greater amount of attention. Barbara tiptoed into the suite of rooms which the girls occupied over the library, expecting to find Helen lying on the lounge. Instead, she found her writing busily at her desk. She tossed down her pen as her sister entered, and taking up a blotter, carefully laid it across the page she had been writing. "Thank heaven I don't have to go to that supper party," Barbara announced, throwing herself full length on the lounge. "So father gave it up," commented Helen. "I am glad." "Gave up nothing," retorted her sister. "He and Margaret Brewster are going." "What?" Helen was on her feet. "You let them go out alone together?" "They can't be alone if they are together," answered Barbara practically. "Don't be silly, Helen." Helen did not answer at once. She had grown singularly pale. Walking over to the window, she glanced into the street. "The car hasn't come," she exclaimed, and consulted her wristwatch. "Hurry, Babs, you have just time to dress and go with them." But I said I wouldn't go," stuttered Barbara, completely taken by surprise. "No matter. Tell father you have changed your mind." Helen held out her hand. "Come, to please me," and there was a world of wistful appeal in her hazel eyes which Barbara was unable to resist. It was not until Barbara had completed her hasty toilet and a frantic dash downstairs, in time to spring into the waiting limousine after Margaret Brewster, that she realized she had put on one of Helen's evening gowns and not her own. Benjamin Clymer was standing in the vestibule of the Saratoga, where he made his home, when the McIntyre limousine drew up, and he did not keep them waiting, as Colonel McIntyre had predicted he would on the drive to Clymer's apartment house.
"The clerk gave me your message when I came in, McIntyre," he explained as the car drove off. "I called up your residence, and Grimes said you were on your way here."
Barbara, tucked away in her corner of the limousine, listened to Mrs. Brewster's animated chatter with utter lack of interest. She wished most heartily that she had not been over-persuaded by her sister and had remained at home. That her father had accepted her lame explanation and her presence in the party with unaffected pleasure had been plain. Mrs. Brewster, after a quiet inquiry regarding her health, had been less enthusiastic in her welcome. Barbara was just stifling a yawn when the limousine stopped at the entrance to the Café St. Mark's. Inside the café all was light and gaiety, and Barbara brightened perceptibly as the attentive head waiter ushered them to the table Colonel McIntyre had reserved earlier in the evening. "It's a novel idea, turning the old church into a café," Barbara remarked to Benjamin Clymer. "A sort of casting bread upon the waters of famished Washington. I wonder if they will ever turn water into wine."
"No such luck," groaned Clymer dismally, looking with distaste at the sparkling grape juice being poured into the erstwhile champagne goblet by his plate. "The café is crowded tonight," and he gazed with interest about the room. Colonel McIntyre, who had loitered behind to speak to several friends at an adjacent table, took the unoccupied seat by Mrs. Brewster, and was soon in animated conversation with the widow and Clymer. Barbara, her healthy appetite asserting itself, devoted her entire attention to the delicious delicacies placed before her. The arrival of the after-theatre crowd awoke her from her abstraction, and she accepted Clymer's invitation to dance with alacrity. When they returned to the table, she discovered that Margaret Brewster and her father had also joined the dancers. Barbara watched them while keeping up a disjointed conversation with Clymer, whose absent-minded remarks finally drew Barbara's attention, and she wondered what had come over the generally entertaining banker. It was on the tip of her tongue to ask him the reason for his distrait manner when her thoughts were diverted by his next remark. "Your father and Mrs. Brewster make a fine couple," he said. "Colonel McIntyre is the most distinguished-looking man in the café, and Mrs. Brewster is a regular beauty." Instead of replying, Barbara turned in her seat and scanned her father as he and Mrs. Brewster passed them in the dance. Colonel McIntyre did not look his age of 47 years. His hair, prematurely gray, had a most attractive wave to it, and his erect and finely proportioned figure showed to advantage in his well-cut dress suit. Barbara's heart swelled with pride. Her dear and handsome father. Then she transferred her regard to Margaret Brewster. She had been such a satisfactory friend. Why, oh why, did she wish to become her stepmother? The twins, with the unerring instinct of womanhood, had decided 10 days before that Weller's warning to his son was timely. Mrs. Brewster was a most dangerous widow. "How is your sister?" inquired Clymer, breaking the silence which had lasted nearly 5 minutes. He was never quite certain which twin he was talking to, and generally solved the problem by familiarizing himself with their mode of dress. The plan had not always worked, as the twins had a bewildering habit of exchanging clothes, to the enjoyment of Barbara's mischief-loving soul, and the mystification of their numerous admirers. "She is rather blue and depressed," answered Barbara. "We are both feeling the reaction from the shock of Jimmy Turnbull's tragic death. You must forgive me if I am a bore. I am not good company tonight." The arrival of the head waiter at their table interrupted Clymer's reply. "This gentleman desires to speak to you a moment, Miss McIntyre," he said, and indicated a young man in a sack suit standing just back of him. "I'm Parker of the Post." The reporter introduced himself with a bow which included Clymer. "May I sit down?" laying his hand on the back of Mrs. Brewster's vacant chair. "Surely, and won't you have an ice?" Barbara's hospitable instincts were aroused. "Here, waiter." "No, thanks, I haven't time," protested Parker, slipping into the chair. "I just came from your house, Miss McIntyre. The butler said I might find you here, and as it was rather important, I took the liberty of introducing myself. We plan to run a story featuring the dangers of masquerading in society, and of course it hinges on the death of Mr. Turnbull. I'm sorry," he apologized as he saw Barbara wince. "I realize the topic is one to make you feel badly, but I promise to ask only a few questions." His smile was very engaging, and Barbara's resentment receded somewhat. "What are they?" she asked. "Did you recognize Mr. Turnbull in his burglar's make-up when you confronted him in the police court?" Parker drew out copy paper and a pencil and waited for her reply. There was a pause. "I did not recognize Mr. Turnbull in court," she said finally. "His death was a frightful shock." "Sure, it was to everybody," agreed Parker. "How about your sister, Miss Barbara? Did she recognize him?" "No," faintly. Parker showed his disappointment. He was not eliciting much information. Abruptly he turned to Clymer, whose prominent position in the financial world made him a familiar figure to all Washingtonians. "Weren't you present in the police court on Tuesday morning also?" Parker asked. "Yes." Clymer modified the curt monosyllable by adding, "I helped Dr. Stone carry Turnbull out of the prisoner's cage and into the anteroom." "And did you recognize your cashier?" demanded Parker. At the question, Barbara set down her goblet of water without care for its perishable quality, and looked with quick intentness at the banker. "I recognized Mr. Turnbull when his wig was removed," answered Clymer, raising his head in time to catch Barbara's eyes gazing steadfastly at him. With a faint flush she turned her attention to the reporter. "Mr. Turnbull's makeup must have been superfine," Parker remarked. "Just one more question. Can you tell me if Mr. Philip Rochester recognized his roommate when he was defending him in court?" "No, I cannot," and observing Parker's blank expression, she added, "Why don't you ask Mr. Rochester?" "Because I can't locate him. He seems to have vanished off the face of the globe." The reporter rose. "You can't tell me where he's gone, I suppose?" "I haven't the faintest idea," answered Barbara truthfully. "I was at his office this—" She stopped abruptly on finding that Mrs. Brewster was standing just behind her. Had the widow by chance overheard her remark? If so, her father would probably learn of her visit to the office of Rochester and Kent that morning. "Do I understand that Philip Rochester is out of town?" inquired Mrs. Brewster. "Why, I had an appointment with him tomorrow." "He's gone and left no address that I can find," explained Parker. "Thank you, Miss McIntyre. Good evening," and the busy reporter hurried away. There was a curious expression in Mrs. Brewster's eyes, but she dropped her gaze on her finger bowl too quickly for Clymer to analyze its meaning. "What can have taken Mr. Rochester out of town?" she asked. The question was not addressed to anyone in particular, but Colonel McIntyre answered it, as he did most of the widow's remarks. "Dry Washington," he explained. "It isn't the first trip Philip has made to Baltimore since the dry law has been in force, Clymer?" "No, and it won't be his last," was the banker's response. "What's the matter, Miss McIntyre?" as Barbara pushed back her chair. I feel a little faint," she stammered. "The air here is stifling. If you don't mind, Father, I'll take the car and drive home." "I'll come with you," announced Mrs. Brewster, rising hurriedly, and as she turned solicitously to aid Barbara, she caught Colonel McIntyre's admiring glance and his whispered thanks. Outside the cafe, Clymer discovered that the McIntyre limousine was not to be found, and, cautioning Barbara and the widow to remain where they were, he went back into the cafe in search of Colonel McIntyre, who had stayed behind to pay his bill. A sudden exodus from the cafe, as other diners came out to get their cars, separated Barbara from Mrs. Brewster just as the former caught sight of her father's limousine coming around McPherson Square. Not waiting to see what had become of her companion, Barbara started up the sidewalk, intent on catching their chauffeur's attention. As she stood by the curb, a figure brushed by her, and a paper was deftly slipped inside her hand. Barbara wheeled about abruptly. She stood alone, except for several elaborately dressed women and their companions some yards away who were indulging in noisy talk as they hurried along. At that moment the McIntyre limousine stopped at the curb, and the chauffeur opened the door. "Take me home, Harris," she ordered, "and then come back for Mrs. Brewster and Father. I don't feel well. Hurry." "Very good, miss," and touching his cap, the chauffeur swung his car up 15th Street. The limousine had turned into Massachusetts Avenue before Barbara switched on the electric lamp in the car and opened the note so mysteriously given to her. She read feverishly the few lines it contained. "Dear Helen, the coroner will call an inquest. Secret letter, B." The note was unsigned, but it was in the handwriting of Philip Rochester. End of chapter 6. Chapter 8 of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Inquest. Coroner Penfield adjusted his eyeglasses and scanned the spectators gathered for the Turnbull inquest.
The room was crowded with both men and women, the latter predominating, and the coroner decided that, while some had come from a personal interest in the dead man, the majority had been attracted by morbid curiosity. There was a stir among the spectators as an inner door opened, and the jury, led by the morgue master, filed into the room and took their places. Coroner Penfield rose and addressed the foreman. "Have you viewed the body?" he inquired. "Yes, doctor," and the man sat down. Coroner Penfield then concisely stated the reason for the inquest and summoned Officer Orion to the witness stand. The policeman stood, cap in hand, while being sworn by the morgue master, and then took his place on the platform in the chair reserved for the witnesses. His answer to Coroner Penfield's questions, relative to his name, residence in Washington, and length of service in the city police force, were given with brevity and a rich Irish brogue. "Where were you on Tuesday morning at about 5 o'clock?" asked Penfield, first consulting some memoranda on his desk. "On my way home," explained Orion. "My relief had just come." "Does your beat take in the McIntyre residence?" "It does, sir." "Did you observe anyone loitering in the vicinity of the residence prior to 5 o'clock Tuesday morning?" "No, sir. It was only when the lady called me that I was attracted to the house." "Did she state what was the matter?" "Yes, sir. She said that she had locked a burglar in a closet, and to come and get him, and I did so." And Orion expanded his chest with an air of satisfaction as he glanced about the morgue. "Did the burglar resist arrest?" "No, sir. He came very peaceably, not a word out of him." "Had you any idea that the burglar was not what he seemed?" "Devil an idea. Begging your pardon." Orion remembered hastily where he was. "The burglar looked the part he was masquerading, and his make-up was perfect," ended Orion with relish. "Never gave me a hint he was a gentleman and a bank cashier in disguise." Kent, who had arrived at the morgue a few minutes before the policeman commenced his testimony, smiled in spite of himself. He was feeling exceedingly low-spirited, and had come to the inquest with inward foreboding as to its result. On what developed there, he was convinced, hung Jimmie Turnbull's good name. After his interview with Detective Ferguson that morning, he had wired Philip Rochester to return to Washington at once. He had requested an immediate reply, and had fully expected to find a telegram at his office when he stopped there on his way to the morgue, but none had come. "Whom did you see in the McIntyre house?" the coroner asked Orion. "No one, sir, except the burglar and Miss McIntyre." "Did you find any doors or windows unlocked?" "No, sir. I never looked to see." "Why not?" "Because the young lady said that she had been over the house and everything was then fastened." Orion looked anxiously at the coroner. Would he make him out derelict in his duty? It would seriously affect his standing on the force. "I took Miss McIntyre's word for the house, for I had the burglar safe under arrest." "How did Miss McIntyre appear?" "Appear? Sure, she looked very sweet in her blue wrapper and her hair down her back," answered Orion with emphasis. "She was not fully dressed, then?" "No, sir." "Was Miss McIntyre composed in manner, or did she appear frightened?" asked Penfield. It was one of the questions which Kent had expected, and he waited with intense interest for the policeman's reply. "She was very pale and breathless like." Orion flapped his arms about vaguely in his endeavor to demonstrate his meaning. "She kept begging me to hurry and get the burglar out of the house, and after telling her that she would have to appear in the police court first thing in the morning, I went off with the prisoner." "Were there lights on in the house?" questioned Penfield. "Only dim ones in the halls, and 2 bulbs turned on in the library. It's a big room, though, and they hardly made any light at all," explained Orion. He was particular as to details. "I used handcuffs on the prisoner, thinking maybe he'd give me the slip in the dim light, but there was no fight or flight in him." "Did he talk to you on the way to the station house?" "No, sir, and at the station he was just as quiet, only answered the questions the desk sergeant put to him, and that was all," stated Orion. Penfield laid down his memorandum pad. "All right, Orion, you may retire," and at the words the policeman left the platform and the room. He was followed by the police sergeant who had been on desk duty at the 8th Precinct on Tuesday morning. His testimony simply corroborated Orion's statement that the prisoner had done and said nothing which would indicate that he was other than he seemed, a housebreaker. Coroner Penfield paused before calling the next witness and drank a glass of ice water. The weather had turned unseasonably hot, and the room in which inquests were held was stifling, in spite of the long opened windows at either end. "Call Miss Helen McIntyre," Penfield said to the morgue master, and the latter crossed to the door leading to the room where sat the witnesses. There was an instant craning of necks to catch a glimpse of the society girl about whom, with her twin sister, so much interest centered. Helen was extremely pale as she advanced up the room, but Kent, watching her closely, was relieved to see none of the nervousness which had been so marked at their interview that morning. She was dressed with fastidious taste, and as she mounted the platform after the morgue master had administered the oath, Coroner Penfield rose, and with a polite gesture indicated the chair she was to occupy. "I am Helen McIntyre," she announced clearly, "daughter of Colonel Charles McIntyre." "Tell us the circumstances attending the arrest of James Turnbull, alias John Smith, in your house on Tuesday morning, Miss McIntyre," directed the coroner, seating himself at his table on which were writing materials. "I was sitting up to let in my sister who had gone to a dance," she began, "and fearing I would fall asleep, I went down into the library, intending to sit in one of the window recesses and watch for her arrival. As I entered the library, I saw a figure steal across the room and disappear inside a closet. I was very frightened, but had sense enough left to cross softly to the closet and lock the door." She paused in her rapid recital and drew a long breath, then continued more slowly. "I hurried to the window and across the street I saw a policeman standing under a lamp post. It took but a minute to call him. The policeman opened the closet door, put handcuffs on Mr. Turnbull, and took him away." Coroner Penfield, as well as the jurors, followed her statement with absorbed attention. At its end, he threw down his pencil and spoke briefly to the deputy coroner, who had been busily engaged in taking notes of the inquest, and then he turned to Helen. "You heard no sound before entering the library? No one walking about the house?" he persisted. "No." She followed the negative with a short explanation. "I lay down on my bed soon after dinner, not feeling very well, and slept through the early hours of the night." "At what hour did you wake up?" "About 4 o'clock, or a little after." "Then you were awake an hour before you discovered the supposed burglar in your library?" "Yes." Helen's hesitation was faint. "About that length of time." "And you heard no unusual sounds in that hour's interval?" "I heard nothing." Her manner was slightly defiant, and Kent's heart sank. If he had only thought to warn her not to antagonize the coroner. "Where were you during that hour?" "Lying down," promptly. "Then, afraid I would fall off to sleep again, I went downstairs." Coroner Penfield consulted his notes before asking another question. "Who lives in your house besides you and your twin sister?" he asked. "My father, Colonel McIntyre, our house guests, Mrs. Lewis C. Brewster, and 5 servants," she replied. "Grimes, the butler, Martha, our maid, Jane, the chambermaid, Hope, our cook, and Thomas, our second man. The chauffeur, Harris, the scullery maid, and the laundress do not stay at night." "Who were at home beside yourself on Monday night and early Tuesday morning?" "My father and Mrs. Brewster. I believe the servants were in also, except Thomas, who had asked permission to spend the night in Baltimore." "Miss McIntyre," Coroner Penfield put the next question in an impressive manner. "On discovering the burglar, why did you not call your father?" "My first impulse was to do so," she answered promptly, "but on leaving the library I passed the window, saw the policeman, and called him in." She shot a keen look at the coroner, and added softly, "The policeman was qualified to make an arrest. My father would have had to summon one had he been there." "Quite true," acknowledged Penfield courteously. "Now, Miss McIntyre, why did the prisoner so obligingly walk straight into a closet on your arrival in the library?" "I presume he was looking for a way out of the room and blundered into it," she explained. "There are 7 doors opening from our library. The prisoner may have heard me approaching, become confused, and walk through the wrong door." "That is quite plausible with an ordinary bona fide burglar," agreed Penfield. "But was not Mr. Turnbull acquainted with the architectural arrangements of your house?" "He was a frequent caller and an intimate friend," she said with dignity. "As to his power of observation and his bump of locality, I cannot say. The library was but dimly lighted. "Miss McIntyre," Penfield spoke slowly, "were you aware of the real identity of the burglar?" "I had no suspicion that he was not what he appeared," she responded. "He said or did nothing after his arrest to give me the slightest inkling of his identity." Penfield raised his eyebrows and shot a look at the deputy coroner before going on with his examination. "You knew Mr. Turnbull intimately, and yet you did not recognize him?" he asked. "He wore an admirable disguise." Helen touched her lips with the tip of her tongue. Inwardly she longed for the glass of ice water which she saw standing on the reporter's table. "Mr. Turnbull's associates will tell you that he excelled in amateur theatricals." Penfield looked at her critically for a moment before continuing his questions. She bore his scrutiny with composure. "Officer O'Ryan has testified that you informed him you examined the windows of your house," he said, after a brief wait. "Did you find any unlocked?" "Yes, one was open in the little reception room off the front door." "What floor is the room on?" "The ground floor." "Would it have been easy for anyone to gain admittance through the window without attracting attention in the street?" was Penfield's next question. "Yes." "Miss McIntyre," Penfield rose, "I have only a few more questions to put to you. Why did Mr. Turnbull come to your house, a house where he was a welcome visitor, in the middle of the night disguised as a burglar?" The reporters as well as the spectators bent forward to catch her reply. "Mr. Turnbull had a wager with my sister Barbara," she explained. "She bet him that he could not break into the house without being discovered." Penfield considered her answer before addressing her again. "Why didn't Mr. Turnbull tell you who he was when you had him arrested?" he asked. Helen shrugged her shoulders. "I cannot answer that question, for I do not know his reason. If he had only confided in me," her voice shook, "he might have been alive today." "How so?" Penfield shot the question at her. "Because then he would have been spared the additional excitement of his trip to the police station and the scene in court which brought on his attack of angina pectoris." Penfield regarded her for a moment in silence. "I have no further questions, Miss McIntyre," he said, and turned to the morgue master. "Ask Miss Barbara McIntyre to come to the platform." Turning back to his table and the papers thereon, he failed to see the twins pass each other in the aisle. They were identically attired, and when Coroner Penfield looked again at the witness chair, he stared in surprise at its occupant. "I beg pardon, Miss McIntyre, I desire your sister to testify," he remarked. "I am Barbara McIntyre." A haunting quality in her voice caught Kent's attention, and he leaned eagerly forward, his eyes following every movement of her nervous fingers, busily twisting her gloves inside and out. "I beg your pardon," exclaimed the coroner, recovering from his surprise. He had seen the twins at the police court on Tuesday morning for a second only, and then his attention had been entirely centered on Helen. He had heard but had not realized until that moment how striking was the resemblance between the sisters. "Miss McIntyre," the coroner cleared his throat and commenced his examination. "Where were you on Monday night?" "At a dance given by Mr. and Mrs. Charles Grosvenor." "At what hour did you return?" "I think it was 5:30 or a few minutes earlier." "Who let you in?" "My sister." "Did you see the burglar?" "He had left," she answered. "My sister told me of her adventure as we went upstairs to our rooms." "Miss McIntyre." Penfield picked up a page of the deputy coroner's closely written notes and ran his eyes down it. "Your sister has testified that James Turnbull went to your house disguised as a burglar on a wager with you. What were the terms of that wager?" "I bet him that he could not enter the house after midnight without his presence being detected by our new police dogs," exclaimed Barbara slowly. She had stopped twirling her gloves about, and one hand was firmly clenched over the arm of her chair. "Did the dogs discover his presence in the house?" "Apparently not, or they would have aroused the household," she said. "I cannot answer that question, though, because I was not at home." "Where are the dogs kept?" "In the garage in the daytime." "And at night?" he persisted. "They roam about our house," she admitted, "or sleep in the boudoir, which is between my sister's bedroom and mine." "Were the dogs in the house on Monday night?" "I did not see them on my return from the dance."
"That is not an answer to my question, Miss McIntyre," the coroner pointed out. "Were the dogs in the house?" There was a distinct pause before she spoke. "I recall hearing our butler, Grimes, say that he found the dogs in the cellar. Mr. Turnbull's shocking death put all else out of my mind. I never once thought of the dogs." "In spite of the fact that it was a wager over the dogs which brought about the whole situation?" remarked the coroner dryly. Barbara flushed at his tone, then grew pale. "I honestly forgot about the dogs," she repeated. "Father sent them out to our country place Tuesday afternoon. They annoyed our guest, Mrs. Brewster." "In what way?" "By barking. They are noisy dogs." "And yet they did not arouse the household when Mr. Turnbull broke into the house." Coroner Penfield regarded her sternly. "How do you account for that?" Barbara's right hand stole to the arm of her chair and clasped it with the same convulsive strength that she clung to the other chair arm. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I can account for it in two ways," she began. "If the dogs were accidentally locked in the cellar, they could not possibly hear Mr. Turnbull moving about the house. If they were roaming about and scented him, they might not have barked, because they would recognize him as a friend." "Were the dogs familiar with his step and voice?" "Yes, only last Sunday he played with them for an hour, and later in the afternoon took them for a walk in the country." "I see." Penfield stroked his chin reflectively. "When your sister told you of finding the burglar and his arrest, did you not, in the light of your wager, suspect that he might be Mr. Turnbull?" "No." Barbara's eyes did not falter before his direct gaze. "I supposed that Mr. Turnbull meant to try and enter the house in his proper person. It never dawned on me that he would resort to disguise. Besides," as the coroner started to make a remark, "we have had numerous robberies in our neighborhood, and the apartment house 2 blocks from us has had a regular epidemic of sneak thieves." The coroner waited until Dr. Mayo, who had been writing with feverish haste, had picked up a fresh sheet of paper before resuming his examination. "You accompanied your sister to the police court," he said. "Did you see the burglar there?" "Yes." "Did you realize his identity in the courtroom?" "No. I only awoke to the situation when I saw him lying dead with his wig removed. The shock was frightful." She closed her eyes for a second, for the room and the rows of faces confronting her were mixed into a maddening maze, and she raised her hand to her swimming head. When she looked up, she found Coroner Penfield by her side. "That is all," he said kindly. "Please remain in the witness room. I may call you again," and he helped her down the step with careful attention. Back in his corner, Kent watched her departure. He was white to the lips. "Heat too much for you?" asked a kindly faced stranger, and Kent gave a mumbled "No," as he strove to pull himself together. What deviltry was afoot? How dared the twins take such risks? To bear false witness was a grave criminal offense. He, alone, among all the spectators, had realized that in testifying before the inquest, the twins had swapped identities. End of chapter 8. Chapter 10 of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At the Club de Vingt. The large building of the popular Club de Vingt, or as one Washingtonian put it, the Club de Vingt, which had sprung into existence in the national capital during the war, was ablaze with light, and Benjamin Clymer, sitting at a small table in one corner of the dining room, wished most heartily that it had been less crowded. Many dinner parties were being given that night, and it was only by dint of perseverance and a treasury note that he had finally induced the head waiter to put in an extra table for him and his guest, Harry Kent. Kent had been very late and, to add to his shortcomings, had been silent, not to say morose, during dinner. Clymer heaved a sigh of relief when the table was cleared and coffee and cigars placed before them. Kent roused himself from his abstraction. "We cannot talk here," he said, looking at the gay diners who surrounded them, "and I have several important matters to discuss with you, Mr. Clymer." His remark was overheard by their waiter, and he stopped pouring out Kent's coffee. "There is a small smoking room to the right of the dining room," he suggested. "I passed there but a moment ago, and it was not occupied. If you desire, sir, I will serve coffee there." "An excellent idea."
Clymer rose quickly, and he and Kent followed the waiter to the enclosed porch, which had been converted into an attractive lounging room for the club members. It was much cooler than the overheated dining room, and Kent was grateful for the subdued light given out by the artistically shaded lamps with which it was furnished. There was silence while the waiter with deft fingers arranged the coffee and cigars on a wicker table. Then, receiving Clymer's generous tip with a word of thanks, the man departed. Kent wheeled his chair around so as to face his companion and still have a side view of the dining room, where tables were being rapidly removed for the dance which followed dinners on Thursday nights. Clymer selected a cigar with care, and leaning back in his chair until the wicker creaked under his weight, he waited patiently for Kent to speak. It was fully 5 minutes before Kent addressed him. "So James Turnbull was poisoned after all," he commented. "A week ago I would have sworn that Jimmy hadn't an enemy in the world." "Ah, but he had, and a very bitter vindictive enemy if the evidence given at the coroner's inquest this afternoon is to be believed," replied Clymer seriously. "The case is remarkably puzzling." "It is." Kent bit savagely at his cigar as a slight vent to his feelings. "Killed by a dose of aconitine by a person or persons unknown was the jury's verdict, and a nice tangle they have left me to ferret out." "You?" "Yes, I am going to solve this mystery, if it is a possible thing." Kent's tone was grim. "And Colonel McIntyre only gave me till Saturday night to work in." Clymer eyed him in surprise. "McIntyre desires to get back his lost securities. Judging from his comments after the inquest, he is not particularly interested in who killed Turnbull." "But I am," exclaimed Kent. "The more I think of it, the more convinced I am that the forged letter with the subsequent disappearance of McIntyre's securities has some connection with Jimmy's untimely death, be it murder or suicide." "Suicide?" Clymer's raised eyebrows indicated his surprise. "Yes," shortly. "Aconitine would have killed just as surely if swallowed with suicidal intent as if administered with murderous design." A pause followed which neither man seemed anxious to break. Then Kent turned to the banker, and the latter noticed the haggard lines in his face. "Listen to me, Mr. Clymer," he began. "My instinct tells me that Jimmy Turnbull never forged that letter or stole McIntyre's securities, but I admit that everything points to his guilt, even his death." "How so?" "Because the theft of the securities supplies a motive for his suicide. Fear of exposure and imprisonment," argued Kent. "But there is no motive, as far as I can see, for Jimmy's murder. Men don't kill each other without a motive." "There is homicidal mania," suggested Clymer. "But not in this case," retorted Kent. "We are sane men, and it is up to us to find out if Jimmy died by his own hand or was killed by some unknown enemy." "Rest easy, Mr. Kent," said a voice from the doorway, and Kent, who had turned his back in that direction, the better to talk to Clymer, whirled around and found Detective Ferguson regarding him just inside the threshold. "Mr. Turnbull's enemy is not unknown and will soon be under arrest." "Who is he?" demanded Clymer and Kent simultaneously. "Philip Rochester." Clymer was the first to recover from his astonishment. "Oh, get out!" he exclaimed incredulously. "Why, Rochester was Turnbull's most intimate friend." "Until they fell in love with the same girl," answered Ferguson succinctly, taking possession of the only other chair the porch boasted. "One quarrel led to another, and then Rochester did for him. Oh, it dovetails nicely. Motive, jealous anger, opportunity, recognition in court of Turnbull disguised as a burglar. At the same time, Rochester learns that Turnbull has been caught after midnight in the house of his sweetheart." "Damn you!" Kent sprang for the detective's throat. "Cut out your abominable insinuations. Miss McIntyre shall not be insulted." "I'm not insulting her," gasped Ferguson, half strangled. "Let go, Mr. Kent. I'm only telling you what that half-crazy partner of yours, Rochester, was probably thinking in the police court. Let go, I say." Clymer aided the detective in freeing himself. "Sit down, Kent," he said sternly. "Ferguson meant no offense. Go ahead, man, and tell us the rest of your theories." It was some minutes, however, before the detective had collected sufficient breath to answer intelligently. "I size it up this way," he began with a resentful glance at Kent, who had dropped back into his chair again. "Rochester knew his friend had heart disease and that his sudden death would be attributed to it. So he took a sporting chance and administered a fatal dose of aconitine." "How was it done?" asked Clymer. "Just slipped the poison into the glass of water he handed to Turnbull in the courtroom," explained Ferguson, and glanced in triumph at Kent.
Neat, wasn't it?" Kent regarded the detective, his mind in a whirl. His theory was certainly plausible, but "Have you other evidence to prove your theory?" he asked. "Yes." Ferguson checked off his points on his fingers. "Remember how insistent Mr. Rochester was that Turnbull had died from angina pectoris?" "I do," acknowledged Clymer, deeply interested. "Continue, Ferguson." The detective needed no second bidding. "Another point," he began. "There never would have been a post-mortem examination if Miss Helen McIntyre hadn't asked for it. She knew of the ill feeling between the men and suspected foul play on Rochester's part." "Wait," commanded Kent. "Has Miss McIntyre substantiated that statement?" "Not yet," admitted Ferguson. "I stopped at her house, but the butler said the young ladies had retired and could not see anyone." Kent, who had called there on the way to keep his dinner engagement with Clymer, had been met with the same statement, to his bitter disappointment. He most earnestly desired to see the twins and to see them together, to make one more effort to induce them to confide in him. For that they had some secret trouble he was convinced. He longed to be of aid, but his hands were tied through lack of information. "Don't imply motives to Miss McIntyre's act until you have verified them, Ferguson," he cautioned. "Go on with your theories." "One moment," Clymer broke into the conversation. "Did Rochester tell you, Ferguson, that he had recognized Turnbull in his burglar disguise?" "No, sir. I never had an opportunity to ask him, for he disappeared Tuesday night and has not been seen or heard of since," Ferguson rejoined. "Hold on." Kent checked him with an impatient gesture. "I had a telegram from Rochester this morning stating he was in Cleveland." "I didn't forget about the telegram," retorted Ferguson. "It was to consult you about that I hunted you up tonight. That telegram was bogus." "What?" Kent half rose from his chair. "Yes. After the inquest I called Cleveland on the long distance, talked with the City Club officials and with police headquarters. All declared that Rochester was not there, and no trace could be found of his having ever arrived in the city." Clymer laid down his half-smoked cigar and stared at the detective. "You think then that Rochester has bolted?" he asked. "It looks that way," insisted Ferguson. "How about it, Mr. Kent?" The question was put with a touch of arrogance. Kent did not reply immediately. Every fact that Ferguson had brought out fitted the situation, and Rochester's disappearance added color to the detective's charges. Why was he in hiding unless from guilty motives, and where had he gone? Kent shook a bewildered head. "It is plausible," he conceded, "but after all, only circumstantial evidence." "Well, circumstantial evidence is good enough for me to work on," retorted Ferguson. "On discovering that the telegram from Cleveland was a hoax, I concluded Rochester must be lurking around Washington, and so sent a description of him to the different precincts and secured a search warrant." "You did?" "Yes. Armed with it, I visited Mr. Rochester's apartment, but couldn't find a clue to his present whereabouts," admitted Ferguson. "So then I went to your office, Mr. Kent, and ransacked the firm's safe." "Confound you!" Kent leaned forward in his wrath and shook his fist at the detective. "What right had you to do such a thing?" "The search warrant covered it," explained Ferguson. "I could look through your safe, Mr. Kent, because Rochester was your senior partner, and you shared the office together. I was within the law." "Perhaps you were." Kent controlled his anger with an effort. "But I had told you I did not know Rochester's whereabouts before I showed you the Cleveland telegram, which you claim is bogus." "It's bogus, all right," insisted the detective. "I thought it just possible I might find some paper which would give me a clue to Rochester's hiding place. So I went through the safe." "How did you get it open?" asked Kent. "I found it open." Kent leapt to his feet. "You found it open?" he stammered. "Why, man, I locked the safe securely just before I left the office at 6 o'clock." "Sure?" "Absolutely certain." "Were you alone?" "Yes, all alone. Sylvester left at 5 o'clock." "Who knew the combination of the safe?" "Only Rochester and I." It was Ferguson's turn to spring up. "By!" he exclaimed. "I thought the electric bulbs in the office felt warm, as if they had recently been burning. Rochester must have been there just before me." "It would seem that Rochester is still in the city," remarked Clymer. "Do you know, Kent, whether he had his office keys with him?" "I presume so." Kent slipped his hand inside his pocket and took out a bunch of keys. "He left these duplicates in his desk at the office." "Sure they are duplicates?" questioned Ferguson, and Kent flushed. "I know they are," he retorted. "Rochester had them made over a year ago as a matter of convenience, for he was always forgetting his keys and kept these at our office." "He's a queer cuss," was the detective's only comment, and Clymer broke into the conversation. "Did you find any address or paper in the safe which might prove a clue, Ferguson?" he inquired. "Nothing, not even a scrap of paper," and the detective's tone was glum. "Did the safe look as if its contents had been tumbled about?" asked Kent. "Nope. Everything seemed in order." Ferguson thrust his hand inside his coat pocket. "There was one envelope in the right-hand compartment which puzzled me." "Hold on. Was that compartment also unlocked?" asked Kent. "It was." Not giving Kent time to speak again, Ferguson continued his remarks. "As this was unaddressed, I brought it to you, Mr. Kent, to ask if it was your personal property." He drew out the white envelope which Helen McIntyre had brought Kent that morning and turned it over so that both men could see the large red seal bearing the letter B. "It is my property," asserted Kent instantly. "Would you mind opening it?" asked Ferguson. "I would, most certainly. It relates to my personal affairs." Ferguson looked a trifle nonplussed. "Would you mind telling me its contents, Mr. Kent?" he asked persuasively. Kent regarded the detective squarely. He could not betray Helen. The envelope might contain harmless nonsense, but she had placed it in his safekeeping. No, confound it, she had left it in the safe for Rochester, and Rochester was apparently a fugitive from justice, while circumstantial evidence pointed to his having poisoned Helen's lover, Jimmy. "If you must know, Ferguson," Kent spoke with deliberation, "they are old love letters of mine." Clymer glanced down at the envelope which the detective still held, the red seal making a distinct blotch of color on the white glazed surface. "Ah, Kent," he said in amusement, "so rumor is right in predicting your engagement to Barbara McIntyre. Good luck to you." Through the open doorway to the dining room, where the dancing had ceased for the moment, came a soft laugh, and Mrs. Brewster looked in at them. McIntyre, standing like her shadow, gazed in curiosity over her shoulder at the three men. "How jolly to find you," cooed Mrs. Brewster. "And what a charming retreat. It's much too nice to be occupied by men only." She inclined her head in a little gracious bow to Ferguson and stepped inside. "Have my chair," suggested Clymer hospitably, as the pretty widow raised her lorgnette and scanned the oriental hangings and lamps, and lastly, the white envelope which lay on the table, red seal uppermost, where Ferguson had placed it on her entrance. "Are your daughters here, Colonel McIntyre?" asked Kent, as he took a step toward the table. McIntyre's answer was drowned in an outburst of cheering in the dining room and the rush of many feet. On common impulse, Kent and the others turned toward the doorway and looked inside the dining room. Two officers of the French High Commission were being held on the shoulders of comrades and were delivering, as best they could amidst cheers and applause, their farewell to hospitable Washington. As his companions brushed by him to join the gay throng in the center of the room, Kent turned back to pick up the envelope he had left lying on the table. It was gone. In feverish haste, Kent looked under the table, under the chairs, the lounge and its cushions, behind the draperies, and even under the rugs which covered the floor of the porch, and then rose and stared into the dining room. Which one of his companions had taken the envelope? Outside the porch, the beautiful trumpet vine, its sturdy trunk and thick branches reaching almost to the roof of the club building, rustled as in a high wind, and the branches swayed this way and that as a figure climbed swiftly down from the porch until, reaching the fence separating the club property from its neighbors, the man swung across it, no mean athletic feat, and taking advantage of each sheltering shadow, darted into the alley and from there down silent, deserted 19th Street. End of chapter 10. Chapter 12 of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Echo of a Laugh. Colonel McIntyre tramped the deserted dining room in exasperation. 9 o'clock, and the twins had not come to breakfast, nor was there any evidence that Mrs. Brewster intended taking that meal downstairs. "Will you wait any longer, sir?" inquired Grimes, who hovered solicitously in the background. "I'm afraid, sir, your eggs will be overdone." "Bring them along," directed McIntyre, and flung himself into his chair at the foot of the table. He had been seated but a few minutes when Barbara appeared and dutifully presented her cheek to be kissed. Then she tripped lightly to Helen's place opposite her father and pressed the electric bell for Grimes. "Coffee, please," she said as that worthy appeared, and busied herself in arranging the cups and saucers.
Helen is taking her breakfast upstairs," she explained to her father.
"How about Mrs. Brewster?"
"Still asleep." Barbara poured out her father's coffee with careful attention to detail. "I peeked into her room a moment ago and she looked so comfy I hadn't the heart to awaken her. You must have been very late at the club last night."
"We got home a little after 1 o'clock." McIntyre helped himself to poached eggs and bacon. "What did you do last night?"
"Went to bed early," answered Barbara with brevity. "Helen wasn't feeling well."
McIntyre's handsome face showed concern as he glanced across the table. "Have you sent for Dr. Stone?"
"No."
"Why not?"
"Helen we Barbara stumbled in her speech. "We have taken an aversion to Dr. Stone."
McIntyre set down his coffee cup with unwonted force, thereby spilling some of its contents. "What?" he exclaimed in complete astonishment, and regarded her fixedly for a moment. His tolerant manner, which he frequently assumed toward Barbara, grew stern. "Dr. Stone is my personal friend, as well as our family physician."
"And a cousin of Margaret Brewster," put in Barbara mildly.
"Well, what of it?" trenchantly, aware that he had colored at mention of the widow's name.
"Nothing." Barbara's eyes opened innocently. "I only recalled the fact of his relationship as you enumerated his virtues."
Colonel McIntyre transferred his regard from her to the butler. "You need not wait, Grimes." He remained silent until the servant was safely in the pantry, and then addressed his daughter. "None of your tricks, Barbara," he cautioned. "If Helen is ill enough to require medical attention, Dr. Stone is to be sent for, regardless of your sudden dislike to him, for which, by the way, you have given no cause."
"Haven't I?" Barbara folded her napkin with neat exactness. It's intangible."
"Pooh!" McIntyre gave a short laugh as he pushed back his chair. "I'm going to see Helen. And Barbara," stopping on his way to the door, "don't be a fool." Barbara rubbed the tiny mole under the lobe of her ear, a trick she had when absent-minded or in deep thought.
"Helen," she announced, unaware that she spoke aloud, "shall have a physician, but it won't be why, Grimes!" awakening to the servant's noiseless return. "You can take the breakfast dishes. Did Miss Helen eat anything?"
"Not very much, miss." Grimes shook a troubled head. "But she done better than at dinner last night, so she's picking up, and don't you be worried over her." With emphasis, as he sidled nearer, "Tell me, miss, is the Colonel courting Mrs. Brewster?"
"Ask him," she suggested, and smiled at the consternation which spread over the butler's face.
"Me, miss!" he exclaimed in horror. "It would be as much as my place is worth. The Colonel's that quick-tempered. Why, miss, just because I tidied up his desk and put his papers to rights, he flew into a terrible passion."
"When was that?"
"Early this morning, miss. And he so upset Thomas, miss, that he gave notice."
"Oh, that's too bad." Barbara liked the second man. "Perhaps father will reconsider and persuade him to stay."
The butler looked unconvinced. "It was about the police dogs," he confided to her. "Thomas told him that Miss Helen wanted them brought back, and the Colonel swore at him. 'Twas more than Thomas could stand, and he ups and goes."
Barbara halted halfway to the door. "Did Thomas get the dogs?"
"You wait and see, miss." Grimes was guilty of a most undignified wink. "Thomas ain't forgiven himself for not being here Monday night, miss, though it wouldn't 'a' done him any good. He wouldn't 'a' heard Mr. Turnbull climbing in or his arrest, away upstairs in the servants' quarters."
"Grimes." Barbara retracted her footsteps and placed her lips very close to the old servant's ear. "When I came in on Tuesday morning, I found the door to the attic stairway standing partly open."
"Did you now, miss?" The two regarded each other warily. "And what hour may that have been?" The butler cocked his ear for her answer. He was sometimes a little hard of hearing, but he waited in vain. Barbara had disappeared inside the library. Colonel McIntyre had not gone at once to see his daughter Helen, as Barbara had supposed from his remark. Instead, he went down the staircase and into the reception room on the ground floor. It was generally used as a smoking room and lounge, but when entertaining was done, cloaks and wraps were left there. McIntyre looked over the prettily upholstered furniture, then strolled to the window and carefully inspected the lock. It appeared in perfect order as he tested it. Pushing the catch back as far as it would go, he raised the window. The sash moved upward without a sound, and he leaned out and looked up and down the path which ran the depth of the house to the kitchen door and servants' entrance. There was an iron gate separating the path from the sidewalk, always kept locked at night, and McIntyre had thought that sufficient protection and had not put an iron grill in the window. McIntyre closed and locked the window,
Then pulling out the gilt chair which stood in front of the desk, he sat down, selected some monogrammed paper, and penned a few lines in his characteristic though legible writing. Picking up some red sealing wax, he lighted the small candle in its brass holder, which matched the rest of the desk ornaments. But before heating the wax, he looked for his signet ring, and frowned when he recalled leaving it on his dresser. He hesitated a moment, then catching sight of a silver seal lying at the back of the desk, he picked it up and moistened the initial. A few minutes later he blew out the candle, returned the wax and seal to a pigeonhole, and carefully placed the envelope with its well-stamped letter B in his coat pocket, and tramped upstairs. Helen heard his heavy tread coming down the hall toward her room, and scrambled back to bed. She had but time to arrange her dressing sack when her father walked in. "Good morning, my dear," he said, and stooping over, kissed her. As he straightened up, the side of his single-breasted coat turned back and exposed to Helen's eyes the end of a white envelope. "Barbara told me you are not well." He wheeled forward a chair and sat down by the bed. "Hadn't I better send for Dr. Stone?" "Oh, no." Her reply, though somewhat faint, was emphatic, and he frowned. "Why not?" aggressively. "I trust you do not share Barbara's sudden developed prejudice against the good doctor?" "I do not require a physician," she said evasively. "I am well." McIntyre regarded her vexedly. He could not decide whether her flushed cheeks were from fever or the result of exertion or excitement. Excitement over what? He looked about the room. It reflected the taste of its dainty owner in its furnishings, but nowhere did he find an answer to his unspoken question, until his eye lighted on a box of rouge under the electric lamp on her bedstand. "Don't use that," he said, touching the box. "You know I detest makeup." "Oh, that." She turned to see what he was talking about. "That rouge belongs to Margaret Brewster." McIntyre promptly changed the conversation. "Have you had your breakfast?" he asked. "Yes, Grimes took the tray down some time ago." Helen watched her father fidget with his watch fob for several minutes, then asked with characteristic directness, "What do you wish?" "To see that you have proper medical attention if you are ill," he returned promptly. "How would a week or 10 days at Atlantic City suit you and Barbara?" "Not at all." Helen sat up from her reclining position on the pillows. "You forget, father, that we have a house guest. Margaret Brewster is not leaving until May." "I had not forgotten," curtly. "I propose that she go with us." A faint "Oh!" escaped Helen, otherwise she made no comment, and McIntyre, after contemplating her for a minute, looked away. "Either go to Atlantic City with us, Helen, or resume your normal everyday life," he said shortly. "I am tired of heroics. Jimmie Turnbull was hardly the man to inspire them." "Stop!" Helen's voice rang out imperiously. "I will not permit one word said in disparagement of Jimmie, least of all from you, father. Wait," as he attempted to speak. "I do not know what traits of character I may have inherited from you, but I have all mother's loyalty, and that loyalty belongs to Jimmie." McIntyre's eyes shifted under her gaze. "I regret very much this obsession," he said, rising. "I will not attempt to reason with you again, Helen, but," he made no effort to lower his voice, "the world, our world, will soon know what manner of man James Turnbull was. Of that I am determined." "And I," Helen faced her father proudly, "I will leave no stone unturned to defend his memory." Her father wheeled about. "In doing so, see that you do not compromise yourself," he remarked coldly, and before the infuriated girl could answer, he slammed the door shut and stalked downstairs. Some half-hour later he opened the door of Rochester and Kent's law office, and would have walked unceremoniously into Kent's private office had not John Sylvester stepped forward from behind his desk in the corner. "Good morning, Colonel," he said civilly. "Mr. Kent is not here. Do you wish to leave any message?" "Oh, good morning, Sylvester." McIntyre's manner was brusque. "When do you expect Mr. Kent?" "In about 20 minutes, Colonel." Sylvester glanced at the wall clock. "Won't you sit down?" McIntyre took the chair and planted it by the window. Never a very patient man, he waited for Kent with increasing irritation, and at the end of half an hour his temper was uppermost. "Give me something to write with," he demanded of Sylvester. Accepting the clerk's fountain pen without thanks, he walked over to the center table, and drawing out his leather wallet, took from it a visiting card, and stooping over, wrote, "You have but 36 hours remaining. McIntyre." "See that Mr. Kent gets this card," he directed. "No, don't put it there," irascibly as the clerk laid the card on top of a pile of letters. "Take it into Mr. Kent's office and put it on his desk." There was that about Colonel McIntyre which inspired complete obedience to his wishes, and Sylvester followed his directions without further question. As the clerk stepped into Kent's office, McIntyre saw a woman sitting by the empty desk. She turned her head on hearing footsteps, and their glances met. A faint exclamation broke from her. "Margaret!" McIntyre strode past Sylvester. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Brewster's ready laugh hid all sign of embarrassment. "Must you know?" she asked archly. "That is hardly fair to Barbara." "So Barbara sent you here with a message." Mrs. Brewster treated his remark as a statement and not a question, and briskly changed the subject. "I can't wait any longer," she pouted. "Please tell Mr. Kent that I am sorry not to have seen him." "I will, madam." Sylvester placed McIntyre's card in the center of Kent's desk and flew to open the door for Mrs. Brewster. As the widow stepped into the corridor, she brushed by an overdressed woman whose cheap finery gave clear indication of her tastes. Hardly noticing another's presence, she turned and took McIntyre's arm, and they strolled off together, her soft laugh floating back to where Mrs. Sylvester stood talking to her husband. End of chapter 12. Chapter 14 of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Pay cash. It was the rush hour at the Metropolis Trust Company, and the busy paying teller counted out silver and gold and treasury notes of varying denominations with the mechanical precision and exactness which experience gives. Suddenly his hand stopped midway toward the money drawer, his attention arrested by the signature on a check. A swift glance upward showed him a girl's face at the grill of the window. There was an instant's pause, then she addressed him. "Do hurry, Mr. McDonald. Father is waiting for me." "Pardon me, Miss McIntyre." He stamped the check and laid it to one side. "How do you want the money?" "Oh, I forgot." She glanced at a memorandum on the back of an envelope. "Mrs. Brewster wishes 10 10s, 5 20s, and 10 1s. Thank you. Good afternoon." And counting over the money, she thrust it inside her bag and hurried away. She had been gone a bare 5 minutes when Kent reached the window and pushed several checks toward the teller. "Is Mr. Clymer in his office, McDonald?" he asked, placing the banknotes given him in his wallet. "I'm not sure." The teller glanced around at the clock. The hands stood at 10 minutes of 3. "It's pretty near closing time, Kent. Still, he may be there." "I'll go and see." And with a nod of farewell, Kent turned on his heel and walked off in the direction of the office of the bank president. On reaching there he saw, through the glass partition of the door, Clymer seated in earnest conclave with 2 men. Happening to glance up, Clymer recognized Kent and beckoned him to come inside. "You know Taylor," he said by way of introduction, "and this is Mr. Harding of New York. Mr. Kent." He turned around in his swivel chair to face the 3 men. "Draw up a chair, Kent. We were just going over to see you." "Yes?" Kent looked inquiringly at the bank president. The gravity of his manner betokened serious tidings. "What is it, Mr. Clymer?" Clymer did not reply at once. "It's this," he said finally with blunt directness. "Your partner, Philip Rochester, appears to be a bankrupt. Harding and Taylor came in here to attach his private bank account to cover indebtedness to their business firms." An exclamation broke from Kent. "Impossible!" he gasped. "I would have said the same thing this morning," declared Clymer. "But on investigation I find that Rochester has overdrawn his account here for a large amount and borrowed heavily. The further I look into his financial affairs, the more involved I find them." "But," Kent was white-lipped, "I know for an absolute fact that Rochester was paid some exceedingly large fees last week, totaling over $50,000. "He has never deposited such a sum, or anywhere like that amount, in this bank, either last week or this," stated Clymer, running his eyes down a bank statement which, with several pass books, lay on his desk. "Does he carry accounts at other banks?" inquired Harding. "Not that I can discover," responded Taylor. "I have been to every national and private banking house in Washington, but all deny having him as a depositor. Did Rochester ever bank out of town, Kent?" "Not to my knowledge." Kent drew out a bank book. "Here is the firm's balance, Mr. Clymer. We bank here, you know." "Yes." Clymer's look of anxiety deepened. "Did you see McDonald as you came in?" "Yes, he cashed some checks for me."
Your personal checks?
Yes? Kent looked questioningly at Clymer. What do you mean?
Only this, that all monies deposited here in the firm name of Rochester and Kent have been drawn out.
That's not possible! Kent started up. Checks on that account must bear both Rochester's signature and mine.
Checks bearing both signatures have been presented for the total sum deposited to your credit, stated Clymer, and he picked up 4 canceled checks. See for yourself.
Kent stared at the checks in dumbfounded silence. Then, carrying them to the light, he examined them with minute care before bringing them back to the bank president. "This is the first I have heard of these transactions," he said.
"You mean?"
"That the signatures are clever forgeries." His statement was heard with gravity. Taylor exchanged a meaning look with the New Yorker. "You mean your signature is a forgery," he suggested. "Rochester had a peculiar gift of penmanship." Kent sprang up. "Do you accuse Philip Rochester of signing these checks and inserting my name to them?"
"I do," calmly.
"I am not familiar with your signature, Kent, but that Rochester wrote the body of those 4 checks and put his own signature at the bottom I will swear to in any court of law. To make them valid he had to add your name." "But damn it, man!" Kent stared in bewilderment at his 3 companions. "Rochester was honorable and straightforward."
"And addicted to drink," put in Harding.
"But not a forger," retorted Kent firmly. Harding's only rejoinder was a skeptical smile as he turned to address Clymer. "So Rochester not only has taken his own money, but withdrawn that belonging to the firm of Rochester and Kent, without the knowledge of his junior partner. It looks black, Mr. Clymer," he remarked, "especially when taken in consideration with his other involved financial transactions." "Where will we find Rochester, Kent?" asked Taylor, before the bank president could answer the New Yorker. Kent paused in indecision. What reply could he make without further involving Rochester in trouble? He had not the faintest idea where Rochester was, but to state that he was missing could not but add to the belief that he had made away with all the money he could lay his hands on. The noon edition of the Times had hinted at Rochester's disappearance, but had stated they could not get the statement confirmed from police headquarters. Obviously, Harding and Taylor had not seen the newspaper. Was it just to the men before him to keep them in the dark? If their claims were true, and Kent never doubted that they were, they had already lost money through Rochester's extraordinary behavior. Kent turned sick at the thought of his own loss. His savings swept away. Would Barbara wait for him? Was it fair to ask her? Taylor broke the prolonged silence. "I met Detective Ferguson on my way here," he stated. "He told me that the police were looking for Rochester."
"What?" Harding looked up startled. "Why didn't you inform me of that?"
"Well, I thought we'd better hear from Mr. Clymer the true state of Rochester's finances," responded Taylor. "I never anticipated such facts as he has given us."
"But if you knew the police were after Rochester," objected Harding.
Clymer broke into the conversation. There was a heavy frown on his usually placid countenance.
"I judge from Detective Ferguson's confidence to us, Kent, at the Club de Vingt, that he was wanted by the police in connection with the Turnbull tragedy. But the facts brought out through Harding's action to attach Rochester's bank account puts a different construction on Rochester's disappearance."
"What had Rochester to do with Jimmy Turnbull?" questioned Harding, before Kent could answer Clymer. "They lived together," he replied shortly.
"And one dies and the other disappears."
Harding whistled dolefully.
"Wasn't Mr. Turnbull an official of this bank, Mr. Clymer?"
"Yes, our cashier."
"Were his affairs involved?"
"Not in the least."
Clymer spoke with emphasis. "A most honorable fellow, Jimmy Turnbull. His murder was a shocking affair."
"Have the police found any motive for the crime, Kent?" asked Taylor. "I believe not." Harding, who had been ruminating in silence, leaned forward, his expression alight with a sudden idea.
"Could it be that Turnbull found out that Rochester was passing forged checks, and Rochester ensured his silence by poisoning him?" he asked.
Clymer and Kent exchanged glances, as Kent's thoughts reverted to the forged letter presented by Turnbull to the bank's treasurer, whereby he had been given McIntyre's valuable negotiable securities. Could it be that Rochester had written the letter, given it to his roommate Turnbull, and the latter, thinking it genuine, had secured the McIntyre securities and handed them over to Rochester? The idea took Kent's breath away, and yet, the more he contemplated it, the more feasible it appeared.
"What's the date on those checks?" demanded Kent. "Tuesday of this week, the day Jimmy Turnbull died." Clymer turned them over. "They are drawn payable to cash and bear no endorsement, which shows Rochester must have presented them himself." Harding and Taylor glanced significantly at each other, but neither spoke. Suddenly Kent pushed back his chair and rose without ceremony. "Don't go, Kent." Clymer took up some papers. "There's a matter—" "It will keep." Kent's mouth was set and determined. "I give you my word of honor that all Rochester's honest debts will be paid by the firm if necessary. I will obligate myself to that extent." He paused. "As for you fellows," turning to Harding and Taylor, who had also risen, "give me 24 hours." "What for?" they chorused. "To locate Philip Rochester." And waiting for no answer, Kent bolted out of the office. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. When the light failed. The city lights were springing up block after block along Pennsylvania Avenue as Detective Ferguson left that busy thoroughfare and hurried to the Saratoga. He stepped inside the lobby of the apartment house a full minute before his appointment with its manager and went at once to look him up. Before he could carry out his purpose, he was joined by Harry Kent. "Finley had to go out," the latter explained. "I told him I would go up to Rochester's apartment with you." Ferguson thoughtfully caressed his clean-shaven jaw for a second, then came to a rapid decision. "Lead the way, sir," he said. "I'll follow." Kent found him a silent companion while in the elevator and when walking down the corridor to Rochester's apartment. But once inside the living room, with the outer door tightly closed, Ferguson tossed down his hat and his whole demeanor changed. "Sit down, Mr. Kent." He selected a chair near Rochester's desk for himself, as Kent found another. "Let's thrash this thing out. Are you working with me or against me?" "Why do you ask?" Kent's surprise at the question was evident. "Because every time I arrange to examine this apartment or to inquire into Rochester's whereabouts, you show up." Ferguson's small eyes were trying to outstare Kent, but the latter's clear gaze did not drop before his. "Are you aiding Philip Rochester in his efforts to elude arrest?" "I am not," declared Kent emphatically. "What prompts the question?" "The fact that you are Rochester's partner," Ferguson pointed out. His manner was still stiff. "It would only be natural for you to help him disappear out of friendship or," with a sidelong glance, "from a desire to hush up a scandal." "On the contrary, I want Rochester found and every bit of evidence against him sifted out and aired," retorted Kent. "Two heads are better than one, Ferguson. Let us work together. Rochester must be located within the next 24 hours." Ferguson debated a moment, but Kent's speech as well as his manner indicated his sincerity, and the detective shook off his suspicions. "Have you any further news of your partner?" he asked. "No. That is," recalling the scene in the bank early that afternoon, "nothing that relates to Rochester's present whereabouts. Now, Ferguson, to put your charges against Rochester in concrete form, you believe that he was insanely jealous of Jimmy Turnbull, that he recognized him in the police court in his burglar disguise, slipped a dose of aconitine in a glass of water which Turnbull drank, and after declaring that his friend had died from angina pectoris, disappeared. Is that all the case you have against him?" "At present, yes," admitted the detective cautiously. "All circumstantial evidence." "But it will hold in court." "Ah, will it?" questioned Kent. "There is one big flaw in your case, Ferguson. The poison used to kill Turnbull." "Aconitine?" "Exactly. Your theory is that Rochester slipped the poison in the glass of water on recognizing Turnbull in the police court. Now, it is stretching probability to suppose that Rochester, a strong, healthy man, was carrying that drug around in his vest pocket." Ferguson sat forward in his chair, his eyes glittering. "Do you mean to say that you think the murder of Turnbull was premeditated and not committed on the spur of the moment?" he asked. "The fact that aconitine was used convinces me of that," answered Kent. Ferguson thought a moment. "If that is the case," he said grudgingly, "it sort of squashes the charge against Philip Rochester." "It would seem to," agreed Kent. "But every shred of evidence I find points to Rochester as the guilty man." Ferguson edged his chair forward. "What have you discovered?" he demanded eagerly. "This," Kent spoke with increased earnestness, "that Philip Rochester is apparently a bankrupt, and that he has overdrawn his private account at the Metropolis Trust Company
and withdrawn our partnership funds from the same bank."
"Your partnership funds?" echoed the detective, eyeing Kent sharply. "How did you come to let him do that?"
"I was not aware that he had done so until Mr. Clymer told me of the transaction this afternoon," answered Kent.
"You did not know?" Ferguson looked at him in dawning comprehension. "You mean Rochester absconded with the funds?"
"Someone forged my name to checks drawn on the firm's account," Kent continued. "I understood they were made payable to cash and presented by Rochester on the day of Turnbull's death." Ferguson whistled as a slight vent to his feelings.
"So you suspect Rochester of being a forger?"
Kent made no reply, and he added, after a moment's deliberation,
"What bearing has this discovery on Turnbull's death, aside from Rochester's need of funds to make a clean disappearance?"
"If it is true that Rochester was financially embarrassed and forged checks on the Metropolis Trust Company, it establishes another motive for the killing of Turnbull," argued Kent. "Turnbull was cashier of that bank."
"I see he may have discovered the forgeries. But hold on."
Ferguson checked his rapid speech.
"When were these forged checks presented at the bank?"
"Tuesday afternoon." Ferguson's face fell.
"Pshaw, man, that was after Turnbull's death. How could he detect the forgeries?"
Kent did not reply at once. Instead, he glanced keenly about the living room. The detective had only switched on one of the reading lamps, and the greater part was in shadow. It was a pleasant and homelike room, and Kent was conscious of a keener pang for the loss of Jimmie Turnbull and the disappearance of Philip Rochester as he gazed around. The lawyer and the bank cashier had been, until that winter, congenial comrades, sharing their business success and their apartment in complete accord. And now a shadow as black as that enveloping the unlighted apartment hung over their good names, threatening one or the other with the charge of forgery and of murder. Kent sighed and turned back to the silent detective. "I can best answer your question by telling you that the day after Jimmie Turnbull died, Mr. Clymer sent for me," he began. "I found Colonel McIntyre with him and was told that the colonel had lost valuable securities left at the bank. These securities had been given by the treasurer of the bank to Jimmie Turnbull when he presented a letter from Colonel McIntyre instructing the bank to surrender the securities to Jimmie."
"Well?" questioned Ferguson. "Go on, sir."
"That letter was a forgery." Kent sat back and watched the detective's rapidly changing expression. "And no trace has been found of the colonel's securities, last known to be in the possession of Turnbull."
"Great heavens!" ejaculated Ferguson. "Which was the forger, Turnbull or Rochester?"
Kent shook a puzzled head. "That is for us to discover," he said soberly. "Colonel McIntyre contends that Turnbull forged the letter and stole the securities, then fearing his guilt would become known, committed still another crime, that of suicide. He could have swallowed a dose of aconitine while at the police court."
"Well, I'll be blessed!" ejaculated Ferguson. "But if he was the forger, how does that square with Rochester's peculiar behavior? The checks bearing your forged signatures were presented, mind you, by Rochester after Turnbull's death."
"It doesn't square," acknowledged Kent frankly. "There is this to be said for Turnbull. He was the soul of honor. His affairs were found to be in excellent condition. He was drawing a good salary, his investments paying well. He did not need to acquire securities or money by resorting to forgery."
"Whereas Philip Rochester was on the point of bankruptcy," remarked Ferguson. "Do you suppose he forged Colonel McIntyre's letter and gave it to Turnbull, and the latter got the securities from the bank treasurer and handed them over to Rochester in good faith, supposing his roommate would give the papers to Colonel McIntyre?"
Kent nodded in agreement. "It looks that way to me," he said gloomily. "Philip Rochester stood well in the community. His law practice is large and lucrative, and if it had not been for his periods of idleness and hesitating, passion for good living, he would never have run into debt."
"But he got there." Ferguson's laugh was contemptuous. "A desperate man will do anything, Mr. Kent."
"I know." Kent looked dubious. "I would believe him guilty if it were not for the use of aconitine. That shows premeditation on the part of the murderer."
"And why shouldn't Rochester plan Turnbull's murder ahead of the scene in the police court?" argued Ferguson. "Wasn't he living in deadly fear of exposure? If he did not commit the murder, why did he run away? And if he is innocent, why doesn't he come forward and prove it?"
"He may not know that he is suspected of the crime," retorted Kent, rising. "It is for us to find Rochester, and I suggest that we search this apartment thoroughly."
"I have already done so," objected Ferguson, "and there wasn't the faintest clue to his hiding place."
For all that, I am not satisfied. Kent walked over and switched on another light. When I came here on Wednesday night, I had a tussle with some man, but he escaped in the dark without my seeing him. I believe he was Rochester." "You are probably right." Ferguson crossed the room. "And if he came back once, he may return again. Come ahead," and he plunged into the first bedroom. The two men subjected each room to an exhaustive search, but their labors were their only reward. Except for an accumulation of dust, the apartment was undisturbed. They had reached the kitchenette pantry when the gong over their heads sounded loudly, and Kent, with a muttered exclamation, hastened toward the front door of the apartment. Ferguson, intent on studying the L of the building as seen from the window, was hardly conscious of his departure, and some seconds elapsed before he turned toward the door. As he gained it, he saw a dark shape dart down the hall. With a bound, Ferguson started in pursuit, and the next second grappled with the flying man, just as the electric lights went out, and they were plunged in darkness. Suddenly Kent's voice echoed down the hall. "Come here, quick, Ferguson!" There was a note of urgency about his appeal, and Ferguson, straining his muscles until the blood pounded in his temples, threw the struggling man into a tufted armchair which stood by the entrance to the small dining room, and drawing out his handcuffs, slipped them on securely. "Stay there," Ferguson admonished his prisoner, "or there will be worse coming to you," and he thrust the muzzle of his revolver against the man's heaving chest to illustrate his meaning. Then, as Kent called again, he sped down the hall and brought up breathless at the front door. The light was still burning in the corridor, though not very brightly, and he saw Kent hand the grinning messenger boy a shiny quarter. Touching his battered cap, the boy went whistling away. "Tell the elevator boy to report that a fuse has burned out in Mr. Rochester's apartment," Ferguson called after him, and the lad waved his hand as he dashed into the elevator. Paying no attention to the detective's call, Kent showed him a white envelope which bore the simple address, Philip Rochester, Esquire, The Saratoga. "It's the identical envelope I found in your safe," declared Ferguson, "and which disappeared last night at the Club de Vingt." Kent turned over the envelope. "See, the red seal." For a minute the men contemplated the seal with the large distinctive letter B in the center. "Open the letter, sir," Ferguson urged, and Kent, his fingers fairly trembling, jerked and tore at the linen-encased envelope. The flap ripped away, and he opened the envelope. It was empty. Instinctively the two men glanced down at the parquetry flooring. Nothing but a thin coating of dust lay there, and Kent looked up and down the corridor. It was deserted. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" asked Ferguson. "No." Kent regarded the envelope in bewilderment. "What shall we do?" "Do? Call up the dime messenger service and see where the envelope came from. But first, come and see my prisoner." "Your prisoner?" in profound astonishment. "Yes, I caught him chasing up the hall after you," explained Ferguson, as they hurriedly retraced their steps. "I put handcuffs on him and then went to you. Ah, here's the light." "The light, yes, but where's your prisoner?" And Kent, who was a trifle in advance of his companion in reaching the dining room, stood aside to let Ferguson pass him. The detective halted abruptly. The chair into which he had thrust his prisoner was vacant. The man had disappeared. With one accord, Ferguson and Kent advanced close to the chair, and an oath broke from the detective. On the cushion of the chair, still bearing the impress of a human body, lay a pair of shining new handcuffs. Dazedly, Ferguson stooped over and examined them. They were still securely locked. Wheeling around, Kent dashed through the door to his right, and Ferguson, collecting his wits, searched the rest of the apartment with minute care. 5 minutes later he came face to face with Kent in the living room. "Not a trace of any kind," declared Kent. "It's the same as the other night. The man's gone. It's positively uncanny." Ferguson's face was red from mortification and his exertions combined. "The fellow must have slipped from the room by that other door and out through the living room as we came down the hall," he said. "Did you shut the door of the apartment, Mr. Kent, before coming down here to look at the prisoner?" "Yes." Kent led the way back to the dining room. "Did you recognize him, Ferguson?" "No." The detective swore softly as he stared about the room. "The lights went out just as I tackled him." "It was beastly luck that the fuse burned out at that second," groaned Kent. "Fortune was with him in that. But how did the man get free of the handcuffs?" pointing to them still lying in the chair. "We can't attribute that to luck, unless," staring keenly at Ferguson,
unless you did not snap them on the man's wrist after all." "I did, I swear it," declared Ferguson. "I'm no novice at that business. Here, don't touch them, Mr. Kent," as his companion bent toward the chair. "There may be finger marks on the steel. If so," he drew out his handkerchief, and taking care not to handle the burnished metal, he folded the handcuffs carefully in it and put them in his coat pocket. "There's no use in lingering here, Mr. Kent. This apartment is vacant now except for us. I must get to headquarters." "Hadn't you better telephone for an operative and station him here?" suggested Kent. "I did so while you were searching the back rooms," replied Ferguson. "There," as the gong sounded, "that's Nelson now." But the person who stood in the outer corridor when they opened the front door was not Nelson, the operative, but Dr. Stone. "Can I see Mr. Rochester?" he asked. Then, catching sight of Kent, standing just back of the detective, he added, "Hello, Kent. I thought I heard someone walking about in here from my apartment next door, and concluded Rochester had returned. Can I see him?" "No." Kent spoke slowly, with a side glance at the silent detective. "Rochester has been here and left." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Crimson Outline. Barbara McIntyre made the round of the library for the 5th time, testing each of the 7 doors opening into it to see that they were closed behind their portieres. Then she turned back to her sister, who sat cross-legged before a small safe. "Any luck?" she asked. Instead of replying, Helen removed the key from the lock of the steel door and regarded it attentively. The safe was of an obsolete pattern, and in place of the customary combination lock was opened by means of a key, unique in appearance. "It is certainly the key which Father mislaid 6 months ago," she declared. "Grimes found it just after Father had a new key made, and gave it to me, and yet I can't get the door open." "Let me try." Barbara crouched down by her sister and inserted the key again in the lock, but her efforts met with no results, and after 5 minutes' steady manipulation, she gave up the attempt. "I am afraid it is impossible," she admitted. "Seems to me I have heard that the lost key will not open a safe after a new key has been supplied." Helen rose slowly to her feet, stretched her cramped limbs carefully as she did so, and sank down in the nearest chair. Her attitude indicated dejection. "Then we can't find the envelope," she muttered. "Hurry, Babs, and close the outer door. Father may return at any moment." Barbara obeyed the injunction with such alacrity that the door, concealing the space in the wall where stood the safe, flew to with a bang, and the twins jumped nervously. "Take care!" exclaimed Helen sharply. "Do you wish to arouse the household?" "No danger of that," but Barbara glanced apprehensively about the library in spite of her reassuring statement. "The servants are either out or upstairs, and Margaret Brewster is writing letters in our sitting room." "Hadn't you better go upstairs and join her?" Helen suggested. "Do, Babs," as her sister hesitated. "I cannot feel sure that she will not interrupt us." "But my joining her won't keep Margaret upstairs," objected Barbara. "No, but you can call and warn me if she is on her way down, and that will give me time to straighten Father's papers," going over to a large carved table littered with magazines, letters, and silver ornaments. Her sister did not move, and she glanced at her with an irritated air, very foreign to her customary manner. "Go, Barbara." The curt command brought a stare from Barbara, but it did not accelerate her halting footsteps. Instead, she moved with even greater slowness toward the hall door, her active brain tormented with an unspoken and unanswered question. Why was Helen so anxious for her departure? She had accepted her offer of assistance in her search of the library with such marked reluctance that Barbara had marveled at the time and now. "Are you quite sure, Helen, that Father had the envelope in his pocket this morning?" she asked for the 3rd time since the search began. "He had an envelope. I caught a glimpse of the red seal," answered Helen. "Then, just before dinner, he was putting some papers in the safe. Oh, if Grimes had only come in a moment sooner to announce dinner, I might have had a chance to look in the safe before Father closed the door." Whatever reply Barbara intended making was checked by the rattling of the knob of the hall door. It turned slowly. The door opened, and pushing aside the portieres drawn across the entrance, Margaret Brewster glided in. "So glad to find you," she cooed.
But why have you closed up the room and turned on all the lights?" "To see better," retorted Barbara promptly, as the widow's eyes roved around the large room, taking silent note of the drawn curtains and portieres, and the somewhat disarranged furniture. "Come inside, Margaret, and help us in our search." "For what?" The widow tried to keep her tone natural, but a certain shrill alertness crept into it, and Barbara, who was watching her closely, was quick to detect the change. Helen's color altered at the question, and she observed the widow's entrance with veiled hostility. "For my seal," Barbara answered. "The one with the big letter B. Have you seen it?" "I? No." The widow took a chair uninvited near Helen. "You look tired, Helen dear. Why don't you go to bed?" "I could not sleep if I did." Helen passed a nervous finger across her eyes. "But don't let me keep you and Babs up. It won't take me long to arrange tomorrow's market order for Grimes." Under pretense of searching for pencil and paper, Helen contrived to see the address of every letter lying on the table, but the envelope she sought, with its red seal, was not among them. When she looked up again, pencil and paper in hand, she found Mrs. Brewster leaning lazily back and regarding her from under half-closed lids. "You are very like your father, Helen," she commented softly. The girl stiffened. "Am I? Babs and I are generally thought to resemble our mother." "In appearance, yes, but I mean mannerisms. For instance, the way of holding your pencil. Your handwriting, even, closely resembles your father's." Mrs. Brewster pointed to the notes Helen was scribbling on the paper, and to an open letter bearing Colonel McIntyre's signature at the bottom of the sheet lying beside the pad, to illustrate her meaning. "These are almost identical." "You are a close observer." Helen completed her memorandum and laid it aside. "What became of father?" "He went to a stag supper at the Willard," chimed in Barbara, stopping her aimless walk about the library. "He said we were not to wait up for him." Helen pushed back her chair and rose with some abruptness. "I am more tired than I realized," she remarked, and involuntarily stretched her weary muscles. "Come, Margaret," laying a persuasive hand on the widow's shoulder. "Be a trump and rub my forehead with cologne as you used to do abroad when I had a headache. It always put me to sleep then, and oh, how I long for sleep now." There was infinite pathos in her voice, and Mrs. Brewster sprang up and threw her arm about her in ready sympathy. "You poor darling," she exclaimed. "Let me put you to bed. Mammy taught me the art of soothing frayed nerves. Come with us, Babs," holding out her left hand to Barbara. But the latter, with a dexterous twist, slipped away from her touch. "I must stay and straighten the library," she announced. Mrs. Brewster's delicate color had deepened. "It would be as well to open some of the doors," she agreed coldly. "The library looks odd, not to say funereal." She glanced down the spacious room and shivered ever so slightly. "Do, Babs, put out some of the lights. They are blinding." "Oh, I'll turn them all out." Barbara sought the electric switch. "But your father—" "No need to worry about father. He can find his way about in the dark like a cat," responded Barbara with unabated cheerfulness. "Seems to me, Margaret, you and father are getting mighty chummy these days." The sudden darkness into which Barbara's impatient fingers, pressing against the electric light buttons, plunged the library and its occupants, prevented her seeing the curious glance which Mrs. Brewster shot at her. Helen, who had listened to their chatter with growing impatience, looked back over her shoulder. "Hurry, Barbara, and come upstairs. Now, Margaret," and she piloted the widow along the hall toward the staircase without giving her an opportunity to answer Barbara's last remark. Barbara, pausing only long enough to pull back the portieres of the hall door and arrange them as they hung customarily, turned to go upstairs, just as Grimes came down the hall from the dining room, carrying a large tray with pitchers of ice water and glasses. "I thought you had gone to your room, Grimes," she remarked, as the butler waited respectfully for her to pass him. "I've just come in, miss, and found Murray had left the tray in the dining room," explained Grimes hurriedly. "I hope, miss, I'll not disturb the ladies by knocking at their doors now with this ice water." "Oh, no. Mrs. Brewster and Miss Helen have only just gone upstairs." Barbara paused in front of the butler and poured out a glass of water. "I can't wait, Grimes. I am too thirsty." "Certainly, miss, that's all right." Grimes craned his head around and looked up and down the hall. Then, leaning over, he placed the tray on a convenient table and stepped close to Barbara. "I've been reading the newspapers very carefully, miss," he began, taking care to keep his voice lowered, "especially that part of Mr. Turnbull's inquest which tells about the post-mortem." "Well, what then?" asked Barbara quickly, as the butler paused and again glanced up and down the hall.
"Just this, miss." He spoke almost in a whisper. "The doctors do say poor Mr. Turnbull was poisoned by aconitine," stumbling over the word. "It's a curious thing, miss, that I brought some of that very drug into this house last Sunday." "You did!" Barbara's fresh young voice rose in astonishment. "Hush, miss." The butler raised both hands. "Hush." He glanced cautiously around, then continued. "Colonel McIntyre sent me to the druggist with a prescription from Dr. Stone for Mrs. Brewster when she had romantic neuralgia." "Had what?" Barbara looked puzzled, then giggled, but her mirth quickly altered to seriousness at the sight of the butler's expression. "Mrs. Brewster had a touch of rheumatic neuralgia the first of the month. Do you refer to that?" "Yes, miss." Grimes spoke more rapidly, but kept his voice lowered. "The druggist told me what the pills were when I exclaimed at their size. Regular little pellets, no bigger than that." He demonstrated the size with the tip of his little finger, and would have added more, but the gong over the front door rang out with such suddenness that both he and Barbara started violently. "Just a moment, miss," and he hurried to the front bell, to return after a brief colloquy with a messenger boy bearing a letter. "It's for Mrs. Brewster, miss," he explained, as Barbara held out her hand. "I'll give it to her, and this also." Barbara took the envelope and a small ice pitcher and glass. "Good night, Grimes. Oh," she stopped midway up the staircase and waited for the butler to overtake her. "Grimes, to whom did you give the aconitine on Sunday?" "I didn't give it to nobody, miss." The butler was a trifle short of breath. His years did not permit him to keep pace with the twins. "I was in a great hurry, as the druggist kept me waiting, and I had to serve tea at once." "But what did you do with the aconitine pills?" demanded Barbara. "I left the box on the hall table, miss." "Great heavens!" Barbara stared at the butler, then without a word she raced up the staircase and disappeared through the open door of Mrs. Brewster's bedroom. The light from the hall shone through the transom and doorway in sufficient volume to clearly indicate the different pieces of furniture, and Barbara put the pitcher and glass on the bedstand and laid the letter which Grimes had given her on the dressing table, then went slowly into her own bedroom. She could hear voices, which she recognized as those of her sister and Mrs. Brewster, coming from Helen's bedroom, but absorbed in her own thoughts, she undressed in the dark and crept into bed just as Mrs. Brewster passed down the hallway and entered her own room. The widow had taken off her evening gown and slippers and donned a becoming wrapper before she discovered the letter lying on the dresser. Drawing up a chair, she dropped into it, let down her long dark hair, and settled back in luxuriant comfort against the tufted upholstery before she ran her well-manicured finger under the flap of the envelope. A slip of paper fell into her lap as she took out the contents of the envelope, and she let it rest there while scanning the closely typewritten lines on the Metropolis Trust Company stationery. "Dear Mrs. Brewster," she read, "our bank teller, Mr. McDonald, has questioned the genuineness of the signature on the enclosed check. An important business engagement prevents my calling tonight, but please stop at the bank early tomorrow morning. I feel that you would prefer to have a personal investigation made rather than have us place the matter in the hands of the police. Yours faithfully, Benjamin A. Clymer." The widow read the note a number of times. Then, bethinking herself, she picked up the canceled check still lying in her lap and turned it over. Long and intently she studied the signature. The peculiarly characteristic formation of the letter B caught and held her attention. As the seconds ticked themselves into minutes, she sat immovable, her face as white as the hand on which she had bowed her head. Across the hall, Helen McIntyre tossed from one side to the other in her soft bed. Her restless longing to get up was growing stronger and stronger. While Mrs. Brewster's deft fingers and the cooling cologne had stopped the throbbing in her temples, they had brought only temporary relief in their train, and not the sleep which Helen craved. She strained her ears to discover the time by the ticking of her clock, but either it was between the half or quarters of an hour, or it had stopped, for no chimes sounded. With a gasp of exasperation, Helen flung back the bedclothes and sat up. Switching on the light by the side of her bed, she hunted for a book, but not finding any, she contemplated for a short space of time a pair of rubber-heeled shoes just showing themselves under the edge of a chair. With sudden decision, she left the bed and dressed rapidly. It was not until she had put on her rubber-heeled shoes that she paused. Her hesitation, however, was but brief. Stepping to the bureau, she pulled out a lower drawer, and running her hand inside,
touched a concealed spring. From the cavity thus exposed she took a small automatic pistol, and with a stealthy glance about her, crept from the room. The library had been vacant fully an hour when a mouse, intent on making a raid on the candy which Barbara had carelessly left lying loose on one of the tables, paused as a faint creaking sound broke the stillness. Then, as the noise increased, the mouse scurried back to its hole. The noise resembled the turning of rusty hinges and the soft thud of one piece of wood striking another. There was a strained silence. Then, from out of the darkness, appeared a tiny stream of light directed full on a white envelope bearing a large red seal. The next instant the envelope was plucked from the hand holding it, and a figure lay crumpled on the floor from the blow of a descending weapon. It was closely approaching 1 o'clock in the morning before Mrs. Brewster stirred from her comfortable bedroom chair. Taking up her electric torch, which she kept always by the side of her bed, she walked quickly down the staircase and into the pitch-dark library. Directing her torchlight so that she steered a safe course among the chairs and tables, she approached one of the pieces of carved Venetian furniture and reached out her hand to touch a trap-door. As she looked for the spring, she was horrified to see a thin stream of blood oozing through the carving until, reaching the letter B, it outlined that initial in sinister red. Scream after scream broke from Mrs. Brewster. She was swaying upon her feet by the time Colonel McIntyre and his daughter Helen reached the library. "Margaret, what is it?" McIntyre demanded. "Calm yourself, my darling." The frenzied woman shook off his soothing hand. "See, see!" she cried, and pointed with her torch. "She means the Venetian casket," explained Helen, who had paused before joining them to switch on the light. Colonel McIntyre gazed in amazement at the piece of furniture. Then, catching sight of the blood stain, he raised the small trap door or peephole in the top of the oblong box which stood breast high, supported on a beautifully carved base. There was a breathless pause. Then McIntyre unceremoniously jerked the electric torch from Mrs. Brewster's nervous fingers and turned its rays on the interior of the casket. Stretched at full length lay the figure of a man, and from a wound in his temple flowed a steady stream of blood. "Good God!" McIntyre staggered back against Helen. "Grimes!" End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Question of Housebreaking. The genial president of the Metropolis Trust Company was late. Mrs. Brewster, waiting in his well-appointed office, restrained her ill temper only by an exertion of willpower. She detested being kept waiting, and that morning she had many errands to attend to before the luncheon hour. "May I use your telephone?" she asked Mr. Clymer's secretary, and the young man rose with alacrity from his desk. Mrs. Brewster never knew what it was to lack attention. Even her own sex were known on occasions to give her gowns and, what captious critics termed her frivolous conduct, undivided attention. "Can I look up the number for you?" the secretary asked as Mrs. Brewster took up the telephone book and fumbled for the gold chain of her lorgnette. "Oh, thank you." Her smile showed each pretty dimple. "I wish to speak to Mr. Kent, of the firm of Rochester and Kent." "Harry Kent?" The young secretary dropped the book without looking at it and gave a number to the operator, and then handed the instrument to Mrs. Brewster. "Mr. Kent not in, did you say?" asked the widow. "Who is speaking? Ah, Mr. Sylvester. Has Mr. Rochester returned?" "Both partners away." She paused. "I'll call later. Mrs. Brewster, good morning." Mrs. Brewster hung up the receiver and turned to the secretary. "I don't believe I can wait any longer," she began, and paused, as Benjamin Clymer appeared in the doorway. "So sorry to be late," he exclaimed, shaking her hand warmly. "And I am sorry also to have called you here on such an errand." Mrs. Brewster waited until the young secretary had withdrawn out of earshot before replying. Then, taking the chair Clymer placed for her near his own, she opened her gold mesh bag and took out a cancelled check and laid it on the desk in front of the bank president. "Your bank honored this check?" she asked. "Yes." "Who presented it?" Clymer pressed the buzzer and his secretary came at once. "Ask Mr. McDonald to step here." And as the man vanished on his errand, he addressed Mrs. Brewster.
"How is Colonel McIntyre this morning?" Mrs. Brewster's eyes opened at the question. "Quite well," she replied, and prompted by her curiosity, added, "What made you think him ill?" "I stopped by Dr. Stone's office on the way downtown, and his boy told me the doctor had been sent for by Colonel McIntyre," Clymer explained. "I hope neither of the twins is ill." "No, Colonel McIntyre sent for Dr. Stone to attend Grimes." "The butler? Too bad he is ill. Grimes is an institution in the McIntyre household." Clymer spoke with sincere regret, and Mrs. Brewster eyed him approvingly. She liked good-looking men of his stamp. "Come in, McDonald," as the bank teller appeared. "You know Mrs. Brewster?" "Mr. McDonald was one of my first acquaintances in Washington," and Mrs. Brewster smiled as she held out her hand. "About this check, McDonald." Clymer handed it to the teller as he spoke. "Who presented it?" "Miss McIntyre." "Which Miss McIntyre?" Mrs. Brewster put the question with swift intentness. "I can't tell one twin from the other," confessed McDonald. "But as you see, the check is made payable to Barbara McIntyre." "The inference being that Barbara McIntyre presented the check for payment," commented Clymer, and McDonald bowed. "It would seem, therefore, that Barbara wrote your signature on the check, Mrs. Brewster." "No." The widow had whitened under her rouge, but her eyes did not falter in their direct gaze. "The signature is genuine. I drew the check." The two men exchanged glances. The bank president was the first to break the short silence. "In that case, there is nothing more to be said," he remarked, and picking up the check, handed it to Mrs. Brewster. Without a glance at it, she folded the paper and placed it inside her gold mesh bag. "I must not take up any more of your time," she said. "I thank you, both." "Mrs. Brewster," Clymer spoke impulsively, "I'd like to shake hands with you." Coloring warmly, the widow slipped her small hand inside his, and with a friendly bow to McDonald, she walked through the bank, keeping up with Clymer's long strides as best she could. As they crossed the sidewalk to the waiting limousine, they ran almost into the arms of Harry Kent, whose rapid gait did not suit the congested condition of the Wall Street of Washington. "I tried to reach you on the telephone this morning," exclaimed Mrs. Brewster, after greeting him. "So my clerk informed me when I saw him a few minutes ago." Kent helped her inside the limousine. "Won't you come to my office now?" "But that will be taking you from Mr. Clymer," remonstrated Mrs. Brewster. "Weren't you on the way to the bank?" "I was," admitted Kent, "but I can see Mr. Clymer later in the day." "And I'll be less occupied then," added Clymer. "Go with Mrs. Brewster, Kent. Good morning, madam," and with a courtly bow Clymer withdrew. Kent's office was only around the corner, and as Mrs. Brewster kept up a running fire of impersonal gossip, Kent had no opportunity to satisfy his curiosity regarding her reasons for wanting to interview him. As the limousine drew up at the curb in front of his office, a man darting down the steps of the building caught sight of Kent and hurried to the car window. "I was just trying to catch you at the bank, Mr. Kent," he explained, and looking around, Kent recognized Sylvester. "There's been 3 telephone calls for you in succession from Colonel McIntyre to hurry to his home." "Thanks, Sylvester." Kent turned to Mrs. Brewster. "Would you mind driving me to the McIntyres? We can talk on the way there." Mrs. Brewster picked up the speaking tube. "Home, Harris," she directed, as the chauffeur listened for the order. Neither spoke as the big car started up the street, but as they swung past Old St. John's Church, Mrs. Brewster broke her silence. "Mr. Kent," she drew further back in her corner, "I claim a woman's privilege to change my mind. Forget that I ever expressed a wish to consult you professionally. And remember, I am always glad to meet you as a friend." "Certainly, Mrs. Brewster, as you wish." Kent's tone, expressing polite acquiescence, covered mixed feelings. What had caused the widow to change her mind so suddenly, and above all, what had she wished to consult him about? He faced her more directly. She was charmingly gowned, and in spite of his perplexities, he could not but admire her air of quiet elegance, and the soft dark eyes regarded him in friendly good fellowship. Suddenly realizing that his glance had become a fixed stare, he hastily averted his eyes from her face, catching sight as he did so of the gold mesh bag lying in her lap. The glint of sunlight brought into prominence the handsomely engraved letter B on its surface. An unexpected swerve of the limousine, as the chauffeur turned short to avoid a speeding army truck, caused both Kent and Mrs. Brewster to sway forward, and the gold mesh bag slid to the floor, carrying with it the widow's handkerchief and gold vanity box.
Kent stooped over and picked up the articles, as well as the contents of the mesh bag, which had opened in its descent and spilled her money and papers over the floor of the limousine. "Oh, thank you!" exclaimed Mrs. Brewster, as he handed her the bag, box, and banknotes. "Don't bother to look for that quarter. Harris will find it at the garage." Kent ignored her remark as he again searched the floor of the car. He was glad of the pretext to avoid looking at the widow. He wanted time to collect his thoughts, for, in picking up her belongings, her handkerchief had caught his attention. He had seen its mate in the possession of Detective Ferguson, and clinging to it the broken portions of the capsules of amyl nitrite which Jimmie Turnbull had inhaled just before his mysterious death. Into Kent's mind flashed Mrs. Sylvester's statement that Mrs. Brewster was in the police court at the time of the tragedy, although in her testimony at the inquest she had sworn she had not heard of Jimmie's death until the return of Helen and Barbara McIntyre. She had been in the police court, and Jimmie had used her handkerchief, a mate to the one she was then holding. The letter B, with its peculiar twist, was unmistakable, and B stood for Brewster as well as for Barbara. Kent drew in his breath sharply. "My handkerchief, please." The widow held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation Kent gave it to her. "Pardon me," he apologized. "I was struck by the handkerchief's appearance." Mrs. Brewster turned it over. "In what way is the handkerchief unique?" she asked, laughing. "Because Jimmie Turnbull crushed amyl nitrite capsules in its mate just before he died," explained Kent quietly. "Detective Ferguson claims that Jimmie unintentionally broke more than one capsule in the handkerchief, was overcome by the powerful fumes, and died." "But the inquest proved that Jimmie was killed by a dose of aconitine poison," she reminded him, as she tucked the handkerchief up her sleeve. Kent did not reply immediately. "A man does not usually carry a woman's handkerchief about with him," he commented slowly. "Odd, is it not, that Jimmie should have used a handkerchief of yours in the police court just prior to his death, while you were sitting a few feet away?" "I?" Mrs. Brewster turned and regarded him steadfastly. She was deadly white under her rouge. "Mr. Kent, are you crazy?" "Yes, crazy to know why you kept your presence in the police court on Tuesday morning a secret," replied Kent. In their earnestness, neither noticed Kent's absent-minded clutch on a small folded paper which he had picked up from the floor of the limousine. "Mrs. Brewster, why did you laugh when Dr. Stone carried Jimmie Turnbull out of the courtroom?" Mrs. Brewster sat still in her corner of the car, so still that Kent, observing her closely, feared that she had fainted. She had dropped her eyes, and her face, set like marble, gave him no key to her thoughts. The door of the limousine was jerked open almost before the car came to a full stop in front of the McIntyre residence, and Colonel McIntyre offered his hand to help Mrs. Brewster out. On the step she turned to Kent, who had lifted his hat to McIntyre in silent greeting. "Your forte lies as a romancer rather than a lawyer, Mr. Kent," she said, and not giving him time for a reply, almost ran inside the house. "Glad you could get here so soon, Kent," remarked McIntyre, signing to his chauffeur to drive on before he led the way into the house. "Grimes has worked himself almost into a fever asking for you." "Grimes?" "Yes, Grimes was attacked in our library early this morning by some unknown person, and is in bed with a bad wound on his temple and a tendency to hysteria," McIntyre explained. "Come upstairs." Kent handed his cane and hat to the footman and followed Colonel McIntyre, who stalked ahead without another word. As they mounted the stairs, Kent glanced at the folded paper which he still held, and was surprised to see that it was a check. The signature showed him that he had unintentionally walked off with Mrs. Brewster's property. His decision to hand it to Colonel McIntyre was checked by the Colonel disappearing inside a bedroom with a muttered injunction to "wait there," and Kent stuffed the check inside his vest pocket. It would serve as an excuse to interview Mrs. Brewster again before leaving the house. He was determined to have an answer to the question he had put to her in the limousine. Why had she gone to the police court, and why kept her presence there a secret? When Colonel McIntyre reappeared in the hall, he was accompanied by Detective Ferguson. "Sorry to keep you standing, Kent," he said. "I have sent for you and Ferguson, first because Grimes insists on seeing you, and second because I am determined that this midnight housebreaking shall be thoroughly investigated and put to an end. This way," and he led them into a large airy bedroom on the third floor, to which Grimes had been carried unconscious that morning, instead of to his own bedroom in the servants' quarters. Grimes, with his head swathed in bandages, was a woebegone object. He greeted Colonel McIntyre and the detective with a sullen glare, but his eyes brightened at the sight of Kent, and he moved a feeble hand in welcome.
"Sit down, sirs," he mumbled. "There's chairs for all."
"Don't worry about us," remarked McIntyre cheerily. "Just tell us how you got that nasty knock on the head."
"I don't know, sir. It came like a clap of thunder."
Grimes tried to lift his head, but gave over the attempt, as excruciating pain followed the effort.
"What hour of the morning was it?" asked Ferguson. "About 1 o'clock, as near as I can tell, sir."
"And what were you doing in the library at that hour, Grimes?" demanded McIntyre.
"Trying to find out what your household was up to, sir," was Grimes' unexpected answer, and McIntyre started.
"Explain your meaning, Grimes," he commanded sternly.
"You can do it better than I can, sir," retorted Grimes. "You know the reason everyone's searching the room with the 7 doors."
"The room with the 7 doors?" echoed Ferguson. "Which is that?"
"Grimes means the library."
McIntyre's tone was short.
"I have no idea, Grimes, what your allegations mean. Be more explicit."
The butler eyed him in no friendly fashion.
"Wasn't Mr. Turnbull arrested in that very room?" he demanded. "And what was he looking for?"
"Mr. Turnbull's presence has been explained," replied McIntyre. "He came here disguised as the burglar on a wager with my daughter, Miss Barbara."
"Ah, did he now?"
Grimes' rising inflection indicated nervous tension.
"Did a man with a bad heart come here in the dead of night for nothing but that foolishness?"
Grimes glared at his 3 visitors.
"You bet he didn't."
Ferguson, who had followed the dialogue between McIntyre and his servant with deep attention, addressed the excited man. "Why did Mr. Turnbull enter Colonel McIntyre's library on Monday night disguised as a burglar?" he asked. Grimes, by a twist of his head, managed to regard the detective out of the corner of his eye.
"Aye, why did he?" he repeated. "That's what I went to the library last night to find out."
"Did you discover anything?" The question shot from McIntyre, and both Ferguson and Kent watched him as they waited for Grimes' reply. The butler took his time.
"No, sir."
McIntyre threw himself back in his chair and his eyebrows rose in interrogation as he touched his forehead significantly and glanced at Grimes. That the butler caught his meaning was evident from his expression, but he said nothing. The detective was the first to speak. "Did you hear anyone break into the house while you were prowling around, Grimes?" he asked.
"No, sir."
The detective turned to Colonel McIntyre.
"After finding Grimes, did you search the house?" he inquired.
"Yes, the patrolman Orion and my new footman Murray went with me through the entire house, and we found all doors and windows to the front and rear of the house securely locked," responded McIntyre, "except the window of the reception room on the ground floor. That was closed but unlatched." Kent wondered if the grimace which twisted the butler's face was meant for a smile.
"That there window was locked when I went to bed," Grimes stated with slow distinctness, "and I was the last person in this house to go to my room."
McIntyre started to speak when Ferguson stopped him.
"Just let me handle this case," he said persuasively. "You have called in the police."
And as McIntyre commenced some uncomplimentary remark, he added with sternness,
"Don't interfere, sir. Now, Grimes, your statements imply one of 2 things. Some member of the household either went downstairs after you had retired and opened the window in the reception room to admit the person who afterwards attacked you in the library, or," Ferguson paused significantly, "some member of this household knocked you senseless in the library. Which was it?" There was a tense silence. McIntyre, by an obvious effort, refrained from speech as they waited for Grimes' answer. "I don't know who hit me." Grimes avoided looking at the 3 men. "But someone did, and that window in the reception room was locked when I went upstairs to my bedroom after everyone had retired. I'm telling you God's truth, sir." McIntyre eyed him in wrathful silence, then turned to his companions. "The blow has knocked Grimes silly," he commented. "There is certainly no motive for any of us to attack Grimes, nor has any trace of a weapon been found such as must have been used against Grimes. Orion and I looked particularly for it, after removing Grimes from the Venetian casket, where my daughter Helen, Mrs. Brewster, and I discovered him, lying unconscious." "What is this Venetian casket like?" asked Ferguson, before Kent could question McIntyre. "It's a fine sample of carving of the Middle Ages," replied McIntyre. "I purchased the pair when in Venice years ago. They are over 6 feet in length, about 3 feet wide, and rest on a carved base. There is a door at the end through which it was customary in the Middle Ages to slide the body, after embalming, for the funeral ceremonies, after which the body was removed, placed in another casket, and buried. There is a square opening or peephole on the top of the casket, through which you can look at the body. A cleverly concealed door covers this opening. In fact," added McIntyre, "the door at the end is not at first discernible, and is hard to open, unless one has the knack of doing so." "Hum! It looks as if whoever put Grimes inside the casket was familiar with it," remarked Ferguson dryly, and McIntyre bit his lip. "Guess I'll go and take a look at the casket. I'll come back, Grimes." Kent rose with the others and started to follow them to the door, but Grimes beckoned him to approach the bed. The butler waited until he heard McIntyre's heavy tread and the lighter footfall of the detective recede down the hall before speaking. "I was only going to say, sir," he whispered as Kent, at a sign from him, stooped over the bed, "I got a box of aconitine pills for Mrs. Brewster on Sunday. The stuff that poisoned Mr. Turnbull," he paused to explain. "Yes, go on," urged Kent, catching the man's excitement. "You gave it to Mrs. Brewster?" "No, sir, I didn't. I left the box on the hall table." Grimes cleared his throat nervously. "I don't know who picked up that box of poison, Mr. Kent. So help me God, I dunno." Kent thought rapidly. "Have you told anyone of this?" he asked. Grimes nodded. "Only one person," he admitted. "I spoke to Miss Barbara last night as she was going to bed." Grimes laid a hot hand on Kent's and glanced fearfully around the room. "Bend nearer, sir. I don't want none other to hear me. Just before I got that knockout blow in the library last night, I heard the swish of skirts. And Miss Barbara was the only living person who knew I knew about the poison." Kent stared in stupefaction at the butler. He was aroused by a cold voice from the doorway. "We are waiting for you, Kent," and Colonel McIntyre stood aside to let him pass from the room ahead of him. Then, without a backward glance at the injured butler, he closed and locked the bedroom door. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Fatal Period. As Kent walked into the library, he found Colonel McIntyre by his side. The latter's even breathing gave no indication of the haste he had made down the staircase to catch up with Kent. Detective Ferguson hardly noticed their arrival, his attention being given wholly to the examination of the Venetian casket which had played such an important part in the drama of the night before. The casket and its companion piece stood on either side of the room near a window recess. The long, straight shape of the high boxes on their graceful base gave no indication of the use to which they had been put in ancient days, but made attractive as well as unique pieces of furniture. Kent crossed the library, and after looking inside the casket, examined the exterior with care. "Don't touch that crest," cautioned Ferguson, observing that Kent's glance remained focused on the blood-stained raised letter B and the carving back of it. "In fact, don't touch any part of the casket. I'm trying to get fingerprints." Kent barely heard the warning as he turned to McIntyre. "Haven't I seen that letter B design on your stationery, Colonel?" he asked. "Barbara uses it," was the reply. "She fancied the antique lettering and copied the B for the engraver. She is handy with her pen, you know." "Did she wish the B for a seal?" inquired Kent. "Yes, she had a seal made like it also." Kent moved closer to the casket. "Found anything, Ferguson?" The detective withdrew his head from the opening at the end of the casket and regarded the furniture vexedly. "Not a thing," he acknowledged, "except I am convinced that it required dexterity to slip Grimes inside the casket. The butler is small and slight, but he must have been unconscious from that tap on the forehead and, therefore, a dead weight. Whoever picked him up must have been some athlete and," running his eyes up and down Colonel McIntyre's well-knit, erect frame, "pretty familiar with the workings of this casket." "Pooh, it's not so difficult a feat." McIntyre shrugged his shoulders disdainfully. "My daughters, as children, used to play hide and seek inside the casket with each new governess." Ferguson stepped forward briskly. "Mr. Kent, let me see if I can lift you inside the casket. Make yourself limp, that's it." As Kent, entering the investigation heart and soul, relaxed his muscles and fell back against the detective. A moment later he was swung upward and pushed head first inside the casket, and the door closed. The air, though close, was not unpleasant,
and Kent, his eyes growing gradually accustomed to the dark interior, tried to discover the trapdoor at the top of the box, but without success. Putting out his hands, he felt along the top. The height of the casket did not permit him to sit up, so he was obliged to slide his body down toward his feet to feel along the sides of the casket. This maneuver soon brought his knees in violent contact with the top, and at the sound Ferguson opened the door and assisted him out. "Had enough of it?" he asked, viewing Kent's reddened cheeks with faint amusement. "I wonder if Grimes could breathe in there for any lengthy period. If so, it would help establish the time which elapsed between his being incarcerated and your finding him, Colonel." "How so?" demanded McIntyre. "Well, if he couldn't get air and you hadn't discovered him at once, he'd have died," explained Ferguson. "If you did find him immediately, the person who knocked him down must have made a lightning escape." "Air does get in the casket in some way," broke in Kent. "It wasn't so bad inside. Colonel McIntyre." Kent stopped a moment to remove a piece of red sealing wax clinging to the cuff of his suit. It had not been there when he entered the casket. Kent dropped the wax in his vest pocket as he again addressed his host. "Who first discovered Grimes in the casket?" "Mrs. Brewster." "And what was Mrs. Brewster doing in the library at that hour?" glancing keenly at McIntyre as he put the question. "She could not sleep and came down for a book," explained the Colonel. Ferguson, who had walked several times around the library, looking behind first one and then the other of the 7 doors, paused to ask, "What attracted Mrs. Brewster's attention to the casket?" "The blood stain on its side," McIntyre answered. "What, that?" Ferguson eyed McIntyre incredulously. "Come, sir, do you mean to tell me she noticed that little bit of a stain in a dark room?" "She had an electric torch," shortly. "But why should she turn the torch on this casket?" persisted the detective. "She came to the library for a book, and the bookcases are in another part of the room." "Quite so, but the book she wished was lying on the top of this casket," replied McIntyre, meeting their level looks with one equally steadfast. "I know because I left the book there." Ferguson glanced from McIntyre to Kent and back again at the Colonel in nonplussed silence. The explanation was pat. "I'd like to talk with Mrs. Brewster," he remarked dryly. "Certainly." Colonel McIntyre pressed an electric button. The summons was answered immediately by the new servant, Murray. "Ask Mrs. Brewster if she can see Detective Ferguson in the library, Murray," McIntyre directed. "Beg pardon, sir, but Mrs. Brewster has just gone out." And with a bow, Murray withdrew. Kent, who had drawn forward his chair preparatory to sitting down and participating in the interview with the widow, changed his mind. "I must leave at once," he said after consulting his watch. "Please inform Mrs. Brewster, Colonel, that I will be in my office this afternoon, and I expect her to make me the visit she postponed this morning. Ferguson," turning his back to address the detective, "you'll find me at the Saratoga for the next hour. Good morning," and paying no attention to Colonel McIntyre's request to remain, he left the room. There was no one in the hall, and Kent debated a moment whether or not to ring for the servant and ask to see Barbara, but at the sight of the hall table, Grimes' confidences recurred to him, and drove everything else out of his mind. Stopping before the table, he contemplated its smooth surface before moving the few ornaments it held. Satisfied that no pillbox stood behind any of them, he pulled open the 2 drawers and tumbled their contents about. His efforts only brought to light some half-empty cigarette boxes, matches, a scratch pad or 2, and old visiting cards. Kent shut the drawers, picked up his hat, and took his cane from the tall china umbrella stand by the hall table. As he stepped through the front doorway, he caught sight of the end of his cane, which he was carrying tucked under his arm. Fastened to the ferrule of the cane was the round top of a pasteboard pillbox. Kent backed so swiftly into the house again that his figure blocked the closing of the front door, which he had started to pull shut after him. Letting the door close gently, he walked back to the umbrella stand. It was a tall, heavy affair, and he had some difficulty in tipping it over and letting its contents spill on the floor. A soft exclamation escaped him as 3 little pellets rolled past him, and then came the bottom of a box. With hasty fingers, Kent picked them up, placed them in the box, and fitted on the top, first carefully smoothing over the hole made by his cane when thrust into the umbrella stand by the footman. Replacing the stand, he wrapped the box containing the pills in his handkerchief, and hurried from the house. Kent found the operative from Detective Headquarters sitting on duty in Rochester's living room, when he entered that apartment a quarter of an hour later. "Anyone called here?" he asked as the man, whom he had met the night before, greeted him. "Not a soul, Mr. Kent." Nelson suppressed a yawn. His relief was late in coming, and he had had little sleep the night before. "There's been no disturbance of any kind, not even a ring at the telephone." Kent considered a moment, then sat down by the telephone and gave a number to Central. "That you, Sylvester?" he called into the mouthpiece. "If Mrs. Brewster comes to the office, telephone me at Mr. Rochester's apartment, Franklin 52. Don't let Mrs. Brewster leave until I have seen her." "Yes, sir," came the reply, and Kent hung up the receiver. "Had any luncheon?" he asked Nelson as the man loitered around. "Not yet." Nelson's eyes brightened at the word. It was long past his usual meal hour. "Run down to the cafe on the first floor and tell the head waiter to give you a square meal and charge it to me," Kent directed. "Order something substantial. You must be used up." The man hung back. "Thank you, Mr. Kent, but I don't like to leave here till my relief comes," he objected. "That's all right. I'll stay in the apartment until you return." And Kent settled the question by opening the door leading into the outer corridor. "Ferguson will be around shortly, so hurry." Kent watched the man scurry toward the elevator shaft, then returned to Rochester's apartment and once more took up the telephone. The operative's reluctance to leave the apartment unguarded had altered his plans somewhat. "Is this Dr. Stone's office?" he asked a moment later, as a faint "hello" came over the wire. "Oh, doctor, this is Kent. Please come over to Rochester's apartment. I would like to consult you in regard to an important matter. You'll come now? Thanks." The doctor kept Kent waiting less than 5 minutes. The clock was striking 1 when he appeared, bland and smiling. Hardly waiting for him to select a seat, Kent flung himself into a chair in front of Rochester's desk and laid the pill box on the writing pad. "Now, doctor," he began, and his manner gained in seriousness. "What, in your opinion, killed Jimmie Turnbull?" "The post-mortem examination proved that he had swallowed aconitine in sufficient quantity to cause death," Stone replied. "He undoubtedly died from the effects of that poison." "Is aconitine difficult to procure?" asked Kent. "It is often prescribed for fevers." Stone made himself comfortable in a nearby chair. "Aconitine is the alkaloid of aconite. I believe that in India it is frequently employed not only for the destruction of wild beasts, but for criminal purposes. The India variety is known as the Bish poison." Kent started. Bish poison? Was he never to get away from the letter B? "Can you procure Bish in this country?" he asked. Stone considered the question. "You might be able to purchase it from some Hindu residing or traveling in the United States," he said, after a pause. "I doubt if you could buy it in a drugstore." Kent heaved a sigh of relief as he hitched his chair closer to the physician. "Did you prescribe a dose of aconitine for Mrs. Brewster recently?" he asked. "I did, for an attack of rheumatic neuralgia." Stone eyed him curiously. "What then, Kent?" "Is this the box the medicine came in?" And Kent placed the cover in Stone's hand. Stone turned the pasteboard over and studied the defaced label. "I cannot answer that question positively," he said. "The label bears my name and that of the druggist, but the directions are missing." "But the numbers on it," put in Kent swiftly. "Come, Stone, call up the druggist, repeat the number to him, and ask if it calls for your aconitine prescription." Stone hesitated as if about to speak. Then, reaching out his hand, he picked up the telephone and held a short conversation with the drug clerk of the Thompson Pharmacy. "That is the box which contained the aconitine pills for Mrs. Brewster," he said, when he had replaced the telephone. "Now, Kent, I have secured the information you wished. Kindly tell me your reasons for desiring it." It was Kent's turn to hesitate. "Do you know how many instances where aconitine was used by murderers?" he questioned. "No, I believe it was the drug used in the celebrated Lamson poison case," replied the physician slowly. "I cannot recall any others just at the moment." "How about suicides?" "It is seldom, if ever, used for suicides." Stone spoke with more assurance. "I have found in my practice, Kent, that suicides can be classed as follows: drowning by the young, pistols by the adult, and hanging by the aged. Women usually prefer asphyxiation, using illuminating gas. But this is beside the question unless," bending a penetrating look at his companion, "unless you believe Jimmie Turnbull committed suicide." "That idea has occurred to me," admitted Kent, "but it doesn't square with other facts which have developed, nor is it in keeping with the character of the man."
Men who suffer from a mortal disease sometimes commit desperate acts, not at all in accord with their previous conduct," responded Stone gravely. "Come, Kent, you have not answered my question. Why did you wish information about this box of aconitine pills prescribed for Mrs. Brewster during her attack of neuralgia?" "You have just stated that aconitine is not usually administered to murder a person." Kent spoke seriously, choosing his words with care. "Do you wonder, then, that I consider it more than a coincidence that Jimmie Turnbull should have died from a dose of that poison, and that the drug should have been prescribed for one of the inmates of the house he visited shortly before his death?" The physician sat upright. His face had grown gray. "Mr. Kent," he commenced indignantly, "are you aware what you are insinuating? Are you also aware that Mrs. Brewster is my cousin, a charming, honorable woman, without a stain on her character?" Kent set the bottom of the box containing the pills in front of the doctor. "I have found out that this box, with its dangerous drug, was left on the hall table in the McIntyre house. Apparently anyone had access to its contents. Therefore my remarks are not directed against Mrs. Brewster any more than against any person in the McIntyre household, from the colonel to the servants. I found these 3 pills at the McIntyre house this morning. How many did your prescription call for?" Stone picked up the small pills and, as he balanced them in his palm, his manner grew more alert. Suddenly he dropped 2 back in the box and touched the 3rd pill with the tip of his tongue. Not content with that, he crushed it in his fingers, sniffed the drug, and again tested it with his tongue. His expression was peculiar as he looked up at Kent. "These are not aconitine pills," he stated positively. "They are nitroglycerin. How did they get in this box?" Kent rubbed his chin in bewilderment. The box bearing the aconitine label and the pills had all rolled out of the china umbrella stand, and he had taken it for granted that the pills belonged in the box. "I found them loose in the same receptacle," he explained, "and concluded they were what remained of the aconitine pills which Grimes, the McIntyre butler, said he left on the hall table Sunday afternoon." Stone smiled with what Kent, who was watching him closely, judged to be an odd mixture of relief and apprehension. "You could not have found more dissimilar medicine to go in this pill box, although the 2 kinds of pills are identical in color and size," he said. "Aconitine depresses the heart action, while the other stimulates it." The physician's statement fell on deaf ears. Raising his head after contemplating the pills, Kent had looked across the room, and his glance had fallen on a wing chair, standing just inside the doorway of the living room, and thrown partly in shadow by the portieres. The wing of the chair appeared to move. Kent rubbed his eyes and, looking again, caught the same slight movement. Bounding toward the chair, Kent saw that the brown shape which he had mistaken for part of the tufted upholstery was the sleek brown hair of a man's well-shaped head. He halted abruptly on meeting the gaze of a pair of mocking eyes. "Rochester?" he gasped unbelievingly. "Rochester?" His partner laughed softly as Stone approached. "I have been an interested listener," he said. "Let me complete the good doctor's argument. Nitroglycerin would have benefited Jimmie Turnbull and his feeble heart, whereas the missing aconitine pills killed him." Stone regarded him with severity. "How did you get in this apartment?" he demanded, declining the challenge Rochester had offered and addressing his opinion of Turnbull's death directly to him. Rochester dangled his bunch of keys in the physician's face and smiled at his excited partner. "If you 2 hadn't been so absorbed in your conversation, you would have heard me walk in." "Where have you been?" demanded Kent, partly recovering from his astonishment which had deprived him of speech. "I decided to take a vacation at a moment's notice." Rochester spoke with the same slow drawl which was characteristic of him. "You should be accustomed to my eccentricities by this time, Harry." "We are," announced Detective Ferguson from the hallway, where he and Nelson had been silent witnesses of the scene. "And we'll give you a chance to explain them in the police court." "On what charge?" demanded Rochester. "Poisoning your roommate, Mr. Turnbull," replied the detective, drawing out a pair of handcuffs. "You are mighty clever, Mr. Rochester. I've got to hand it to you for your mysterious disappearances in and out of this apartment, and for murdering Mr. Turnbull right in the police court, in the presence of the judge, police officials, and spectators." Kent stepped forward at sight of the handcuffs
and laid a restraining hand on the detective's shoulder. Rochester saw the movement, guessed Kent's intention, and smiled. "We can settle this case here," he said cheerfully. "No need of troubling the police judge. Now, Mr. Detective, how did I kill Jimmie Turnbull before all those people without anyone becoming aware of the fact?" "Slipped the poison in the glass of water you handed him," answered Ferguson promptly. "A nervy sleight of hand, but you'll swing for it." Rochester's smile was exasperating as he turned to Dr. Stone. "Judging from Stone's remarks about aconitine, which I overheard," he interpolated, "I gather the doctor is tolerably familiar with the action of the drug. Does aconitine kill instantly, doctor?" Stone cleared his throat before speaking. "No, the fatal period averages about 4 hours," he said, and Rochester's eyes sparkled as he looked up at the detective. "Jimmie died almost immediately after I handed him that drink of water," he declared. "If you wish to know who administered that aconitine poison, you will have to find out who Jimmie was with at the McIntyre house in the early hours of Tuesday morning." The sharp imperative ring of the telephone bell cut the silence which followed. Kent, standing nearest the instrument, picked it up, and recognized Sylvester's voice over the wire. "A message has just come in, Mr. Kent," he called, "from Mrs. Brewster, saying that she will be in your office at 4 o'clock." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Red Seal again. Harry Kent inserted his key in his office door with more vigor than good judgment, and spent some seconds in readjusting it in the lock. Once inside the office, he put up the latch and closed the door. A glance around the empty office showed him that Sylvester had obeyed his telephone instructions and gone out to luncheon. Kent noted with satisfaction, as he put his hat and cane in the coat closet, that he had over 2 hours before Mrs. Brewster's expected arrival, ample time in which to consider in quietude the events of the past few days, and plan for his interview with the pretty widow. He had spent the time between Rochester's sudden reappearance and a hastily swallowed lunch at a downtown cafe in arranging bail for Rochester. Ferguson had proved obdurate and had persisted in taking the lawyer to police headquarters. Dr. Stone had accompanied the trio, and his testimony, supported by 2 chemists, regarding the time required for aconitine poison to act, had gone far to weaken the detective's case against Rochester. Rochester, to Kent's unbounded astonishment, had appeared indifferent to the whole proceedings, and to his partner's urgent inquiries as to where he had spent the past 4 days, and why he had disappeared, he had returned one invariable answer. "I'll explain in good time, Harry," and it was not until they were leaving police headquarters that his apathy vanished. "When are you to see Mrs. Brewster?" he asked. "She will be at our office at 4 o'clock. Say, Phil." But Rochester, shaking off his detaining hand, darted across the street and sprang into a passing taxi bearing the sign "For Hire," and that was the last Kent had seen of his elusive partner. Kent dropped into his chair and glanced askance at the mail piled in neat array on his desk. He was not in a frame of mind to handle routine office business. Other clients would have to wait until later in the day. A memorandum pad, bearing a message in Sylvester's precise penmanship, attracted his wandering attention, and he picked it up. "Mr. Kent," he read, "Colonel McIntyre called just after I talked with you on the phone. He waited in your office for half an hour, then left, stating that he would come back. Miss Barbara McIntyre called immediately afterwards, but would not wait more than 5 minutes. Mr. Clymer came as she was going out, and left a note on your desk. I will return soon. Sylvester." Kent laid down the pad and picked up a twisted 3-cornered note bearing his name in pencil. Unfolding it, he scanned the hurriedly written lines. "Dear Kent, McIntyre telephoned. There were new developments in the Turnbull affair. Will be back later. Yours, B. A. Clymer." Kent judged from the use of his initials that Clymer was stirred out of his ordinary calm. Nothing else explained his failure to sign his full name, and he wondered what confidences McIntyre had made to the bank president. Tossing down the note, Kent lighted his pipe, tilted back in his swivel chair, and reviewed the facts which implicated Rochester in Jimmie Turnbull's murder. Rochester's quarrels with Jimmy, his persistent assertion that his friend had died from angina pectoris, his unexplained disappearance on Tuesday night, the fake telegram from Cleveland stating he was there, the withdrawal of his bank deposits, the forged checks, his mysterious visits to his own apartment, when considered together, presented a chain of circumstantial evidence connecting him with the crime. But in light of Dr. Stone's testimony, the poison could not have been administered in the glass of water Rochester had given Jimmy in the police court. 4 hours at least had to elapse before the fatal dose of aconitine could take effect. 4 hours! Kent told them off on his fingers. It placed the crime in the McIntyre house. Which one of its inmates administered the poison to Jimmy, and how had it been done? What motive had prompted the cashier's murder? It was preposterous to think that either of the twins was guilty of the crime. Helen's devotion to Jimmy, her insistence upon an autopsy being held, indicated her innocence. She had stated at the inquest that she had not known the burglar's identity. Kent paused as the thought occurred to him. The twins had swapped identities on the witness stand, and therefore Helen had not been called upon to answer that question. To the best of his recollection, she had only been asked if she had recognized Jimmy in the courtroom, and not at her home. But Helen it was who had summoned Officer Orion on discovering the burglar and had him arrested. She surely would never have done so had she guessed his identity. As for Barbara McIntyre, Kent's heart beat faster at the thought of the girl he loved so well. Circumstantial evidence had seemed for a time to involve her in the crime. Grimes's outrageous insinuation that he had been assaulted on account of confiding to her that the box of aconitine pills had been left on the hall table where anyone could get them was the outcome of his battered condition. When physical strength returned, the butler would forget his hallucinations. The handkerchief with its embroidered letter B, used by Jimmy to inhale the fumes from his amyl nitrite capsules, was finally traced to its rightful owner, Mrs. Brewster. And Mrs. Brewster was due in his office within a very short time. Kent's square jaw became more pronounced. She should not leave until she had either confessed her connection with Turnbull's death or established her innocence. Surely it would be easy for Mrs. Brewster to do so. But aconitine had been prescribed for her. She was familiar with the poison. She had it at hand. She went to the police court and kept her trip a secret. And she had laughed when Jimmy was carried dying from the courtroom. But what motive could have inspired her to murder Jimmy? Was he an old lover? Kent, unable to keep quiet any longer, rose and paced up and down the office, stopping a moment to glance out of the window. As he passed the safe, he saw the door was ajar. Kent paused abruptly. Who had opened the safe? Crossing to the outer office, he looked around. No one was there. It flashed into Kent's mind that he had seen Rochester's light topcoat and walking stick in the coat closet as he hung up his hat on his arrival, and he again opened the closet door. The coat and stick were still there. So Rochester had come to the office immediately after leaving him, and carelessly left the safe open. Kent smiled in spite of his vexation. The act was typical of his eccentric partner. Going back to his own office, Kent opened the safe and glanced inside. The pigeonholes and compartments appeared untouched, except the door of one of the small compartments on Rochester's side. An envelope was wedged in such a manner that the small door would not shut, and that had prevented the closing of the outer safe door. Kent, preparatory to shutting the safe, drew out the envelope, intending to place it in another pigeonhole where there was more room. As he turned the envelope over, he was thunderstruck to recognize it as the one which Helen McIntyre had placed in the safe on Wednesday morning. He had last seen the envelope lying on the table in the smoking porch of the Club de Vingt, from whence it had mysteriously disappeared, and now it was back again in Rochester's safe. Had it ever been missing from the safe? The question forced itself on Kent as he returned to his chair, envelope in hand, and sat down before his desk. He had accepted Detective Ferguson's statement that he had removed the envelope from the safe, and therefore had never looked in the compartment where Helen had put it to verify its disappearance. Ferguson had removed it, Kent concluded as he examined the envelope with more care. It was the identical one, unaddressed, with the same red seal holding down the flap. The same red seal, but with a difference. A corner was missing. Kent stared at the seal for a moment in doubt. Then his fingers sought his vest pocket and fumbled about for a minute. Taking out Mrs. Brewster's check, he laid it on the desk alongside the envelope, unfolded it, and picked out a piece of red sealing wax which had slid inside the check. Kent placed the red wax on the broken section of the seal. It fitted exactly, forming a perfect letter B. Kent sat in dumbfounded silence, regarding the red seal and the envelope. The piece of wax broken off from the seal had caught on his coat sleeve when he had been in the Venetian casket in the library at the McIntyre house. It was proof positive that not only he had been in the casket, but the sealed envelope also. Helen McIntyre had left the envelope in his care. Mrs. Brewster and Colonel McIntyre had both been present when the envelope was stolen from him. Which of them had taken it? Which one had afterwards secreted it in the Venetian casket? And which had brought it back to the safe in his office? Colonel McIntyre had been in his office within the hour. The question was answered, and Kent's eyes brightened, then clouded. Barbara had been there as well, and Grimes had stated that before he received a knockout blow in the McIntyre library, he heard the swish of skirts. Kent laid his hand on the envelope. It was time that he found out what it contained, but his finger, inserted under the flap, paused as his eyes fell on the check bearing Mrs. Brewster's signature. It was the check he had picked up from the floor of the McIntyre limousine that morning, and inadvertently carried away with him. From her signature his glance wandered to Sylvester's memorandum pad. It was uncanny the way his eye picked out the letter B as he stared at Clymer's note and its signature. Slowly his hand dropped away from the envelope, and he left it lying forgotten on the desk as he picked up piece after piece of blotting paper, glancing intently at each, and finally, pulling open a drawer of his desk, he hunted in feverish haste for a hand mirror. Some 10 minutes later Kent rose, placed the papers he had been examining in the inside pocket of his coat, and, using the private entrance from his office into the corridor, he hurried away. When Helen McIntyre entered the office of Rochester and Kent for the second time that afternoon, she found Sylvester transcribing stenographic notes on his typewriter. "Mr. Kent is expecting you, miss," he said, holding open the inner office door, and with a courteous word of thanks, Helen passed the clerk and the door closed behind her. Kent rose at her approach and bowed formally. "Take this chair," he suggested, and not until she was seated did Helen realize he had placed her where the light fell full upon her. "I asked you to come here," he began, as she waited for him to speak, "because I must have your confidence, if I am to aid you. Did you meet, recognize, and talk to Jimmie Turnbull in your house sometime between Monday midnight and his arrest on Tuesday morning?" She colored hotly, then paled. "My testimony at the inquest," she commenced, but he gave her no opportunity to add more. "Your testimony there does not cover the question," he explained. "You stated that you had not recognized Jimmie in the courtroom. Had you already penetrated his disguise at your house?" "And if I had?" "Did you?" Kent was doggedly persistent, and Helen's fingers closed round her handbag with convulsive force. Why had she not sent Barbara to see Kent in her place? "Did I what?" she parried. "Did you recognize and talk with Jimmie Turnbull in your house?" "I talked with him, yes," she admitted, and her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "As Jimmie Turnbull or Smith the burglar?" "As Jimmie," she confessed after a slight pause. "Then why did you go through the farce of having Jimmie arrested as a burglar?" Kent demanded. "So that Barbara might win her wager," promptly. Kent stared at her incredulously. "Do you mean that, notwithstanding the risk to which you were subjecting him with his weak heart, you kept up the farce simply that Barbara might win an idiotic wager?" Kent asked. Helen passed one nervous hand over the other. Her palms were hot and dry, and 2 hectic spots had appeared in each white cheek. "Jimmie was quite well Monday night," she protested. He had some heart medicine with him." "Amyl nitrite?" "No." "Nitroglycerin?" I think that was it. I'm not quite sure." She spoke with uncertainty, and Kent knew that she lied. His heart sank. "Did he swallow any medicine in your presence?" She shook her head vigorously. "No, he did not." Kent lowered his voice. "Did you see him take Mrs. Brewster's aconitine pills off the hall table?" Helen shifted her gaze to his face and then back to her ever-restless hands. "No," she said, "I did not see him take the pills." Kent studied her in silence which, to her, seemed never-ending. "I want the true answer to this question," he announced with meaning emphasis. "Why did Jimmy go in disguise to your house on Monday night?" Helen blanched. "How should I know?" she muttered evasively. He didn't come to see me." The admission was barely above a whisper. "But you know what transpired in your house on Monday night?" demanded Kent eagerly. His question met with no response, and he repeated it, but still the girl remained silent. Kent gave her a moment's grace. Then drawing the unaddressed envelope from his pocket, he held it toward her. A low cry broke from her, and her expression changed as she caught sight of the broken seal. "You have opened it!" "Not yet." Kent held the envelope just beyond her reach. "I will only give it to you with the understanding that you open the envelope now in my presence, and let me see its contents." Helen drew back, then impulsively extended her hand. "I agree," she said. "Give me the envelope." "Stop!" The word rang out, startling Kent as well as Helen, and Mrs. Brewster, whose noiseless entrance a few seconds before had gone unobserved, hurried to them. "The envelope is mine." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Unknown Equation. "No, no," protested Helen vehemently. "You shall not give the envelope to Margaret. You must not." "It is mine," insisted the widow with equal vehemence. "Mrs. Brewster," Kent withheld the envelope from both women. "Will you tell me the contents of the envelope?" "No," curtly. "It is not your affair." "It is my affair," retorted Kent with equal shortness of manner. "I insist on an answer to my questions in the limousine this morning. How came your handkerchief in Jimmy's possession, and why did you go to the police court and, yet, keep your presence there a secret?" "Jimmy must have picked up the handkerchief when in the McIntyre house," she answered sullenly. "I presume he forgot to provide himself with one in his make-up as burglar. As regards your second question, I admit I did go to the police court out of curiosity. I wanted to find out what was going on. You," with a resentful glance at Helen, "treated me as an outsider, and I was determined to find out for myself how the burglar farce would end." "Ah, you term it a farce. Is that why you laughed in court?" asked Kent quickly. Mrs. Brewster changed color. "I feel badly about that," she stammered. "I meant no disrespect to Jimmy, but I have a nervous inclination to laugh, almost hysteria, when excited and overwrought." "I see," answered Kent slowly. He was distinctly puzzled. Mrs. Brewster's air of candor disarmed suspicion, but "You saw and talked with Jimmy Turnbull on Monday night?" "I did not." Her denial was firm. "Then how did you learn of his arrest?" asked Kent swiftly. "I overheard him conversing." "With whom?" Kent demanded eagerly as she paused as if to reconsider her confidences. Helen, one hand on the desk and the other on the arm of her chair, tried to rise, but her strength had deserted her. "With whom?" repeated Kent as the widow remained silent. "Jimmy was talking with Grimes," Mrs. Brewster stated slowly. "From what I overheard, he paid Grimes to let him inside the house." Kent looked perplexed as he gazed first at the widow and then at Helen, who had sunk back in her chair. "Mrs. Brewster," he began after a pause, "who gave Jimmy your aconitine pills which Grimes left on the hall table?" "The murderer." "Yes, of course." Kent was watching her closely, and he detected the tiny beads of perspiration which were gathering on her upper lip. "And who, in your opinion, was the murderer?" Mrs. Brewster's expression changed. She looked hunted, and her eyes fell before Kent's. Abruptly she turned her back on him, to find Colonel McIntyre at her elbow and Barbara just entering the room. Her eyes traveled past the girl until they rested on Philip Rochester and Detective Ferguson hovering behind him. Her face altered. "I saw Philip Rochester," pointing dramatically toward him, "crawl out of the reception room window and dart into the street just as Orion came in the front door with Helen." Detective Ferguson could not restrain a joyful exclamation. "So that was it," he cried.
You were at the McIntyre house and gave the poison to Turnbull there, and not in the courtroom, 4 hours before he died. You'll swing for that crime, my buck, in spite of your glib tongue and slippery ways." As he ceased speaking, Ferguson's ever-ready handcuffs swung suggestively from his hand, but Helen's agonized cry checked his approach toward Rochester, who stood stolidly waiting for him. "Father, you cannot permit this monstrous injustice. Philip shall not suffer for another. No, Barbara," as her sister strove to quiet her, "we must tell the truth." "Suppose I tell it for Colonel McIntyre." Rochester advanced as the door opened and Sylvester ushered in Benjamin Clymer. "You have come in time, Clymer." His voice deepened, the voice of a man accustomed to present a case and sway a court. "Wait, Sylvester. Sit at that table and take down these charges." "Charges?" questioned Kent, watching his partner narrowly. He tossed a stenographic pad to Sylvester and made a place for him at his desk. "Go on, Rochester. Charges against whom?" "Charges against the man who, occupying a position of trust, planned to swindle the Metropolis Trust Company through forged notes and checks," Rochester stated with slow emphasis. "Jimmy Turnbull learned that you, Clymer, were to visit Colonel McIntyre on Monday night, and he went there in disguise to find out if his suspicions were correct. The investigation cost him his life." Clymer, who had followed Rochester's statement, first with bewilderment and then with rising wrath, found his voice. "You drunken scoundrel!" he roared. "How dare you?" "Dare!" Rochester laughed recklessly. "Jimmy kept his wits to the last. His mind was clear. He recognized you in the prisoner's pen, and he tried to call you, but his palsied tongue could not say Ben, but stuttered b. "And what did he wish to tell me?" gasped Clymer, down whose colorless face perspiration trickled. "What?" broke in Kent significantly. "Jimmy may not have gotten the information he wished at your house, Colonel McIntyre, but his presence there on Monday night showed the forger he was in danger, and, like the human snake he is, he poisoned without warning. Don't move, Sylvester." With a backward spring, Kent caught his clerk as he sped for the door. "Don't make any mistakes in putting on the handcuffs this time, Ferguson," he shouted. "A forger and a contortionist make a bad customer to reckon with." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Riddle Answered. There was absolute stillness in the room. Then a babel of exclamations broke out as Sylvester, his expression of dumb surprise giving place to one of fury, struggled to free himself from the detective's firm grip. "You cannot escape, Sylvester," declared Kent, observing his efforts. "Your carelessness in using your peculiar gift of penmanship in copying Barbara McIntyre's signature in this memorandum of her visit here," Kent held up a sheet torn from his pad, "gave me the first clue. These the second." He showed several pieces of blotting paper freshly used. "See, in the mirror here is reflected the impression from your clever imitations of the handwritings of Barbara, Colonel McIntyre, and Mrs. Brewster." They crowded about Kent, all but Ferguson and his prisoner, who had subsided in his chair with what the detective concluded was dangerous quietude. "My next step, now that suspicion was directed against Sylvester, was to make personal inquiries regarding him," went on Kent. "Judge Hildebrand, who had just returned to Washington, said that he first met Sylvester at a circus sideshow where he gave exhibitions as a contortionist. One of his special stunts was to slip out of handcuffs and ropes." "So that explains last night." Ferguson grinned. "You'll not do it again, Sylvester," and he shook an admonitory finger at the erstwhile clerk. "Judge Hildebrand became interested in Sylvester, found he was handy with his pen and tired of the show business, and gave him an opening by engaging him as a confidential clerk," continued Kent. "You will recall, Colonel McIntyre, that you sent business papers in your handwriting and that of your daughters to Judge Hildebrand's office to be typed by his staff. That is how Sylvester became so well acquainted with your writing and was able to forge a letter to the bank treasurer directing him to turn over your negotiable securities to Jimmy Turnbull." "But how in the world did Sylvester induce Jimmy to present the forged letter?" asked Colonel McIntyre. Kent turned to the sullen prisoner. "Answer that question, Sylvester," he commanded, and the man roused himself from his dejected attitude. "Anything in it for me if I do?" he asked with a cunning leer. "That's for the courts to decide," declared Kent. The man thought a minute. I'll take a chance," he said finally. "But that I waited for an opportunity to get my swag out of this safe, I wouldn't have been caught. Curse you!" And he scowled at Kent. "Cut that out," admonished Ferguson, with a none too gentle dig in the ribs, and Sylvester continued his statement. "I overheard Colonel McIntyre tell Judge Hildebrand about his securities and their present value, and the next day he came to consult the judge about engaging a secretary. I fixed up credentials and went to Mr. Turnbull. He believed my story that I was the colonel's new secretary and got the securities." Sylvester paused. "If I'd rested content with that success, I'd have been all right," he added. "But I was in too great a hurry and forged Mr. Clymer's signature to a check for $5,000 and presented it at the Metropolis Trust Company. As luck would have it, Mr. Turnbull cashed it for me himself." "But didn't he suspect you?" exclaimed Clymer. He had gradually recovered from the shock of Rochester's charges on his arrival, and was listening with keen attention to Sylvester's confession. "No, I made the check payable to Colonel McIntyre and forged his endorsement." Sylvester spoke with an air of pride, and he smiled in malicious enjoyment as, catching his eye, Barbara shrank back and sheltered herself behind Kent. "Mr. Turnbull accepted the check. Later something must have aroused his suspicions, and I found when he questioned me that he believed Colonel McIntyre had forged the check." "Good heavens! You let him think that?" gasped McIntyre. Then wrath gained the mastery. "You scoundrel!" "Oh, I encouraged him to think it." Sylvester grinned again. "You must have handed Mr. Turnbull a raw deal. He was so ready to think evil of you." "That is a lie!" exclaimed Helen hotly. "When I went downstairs to investigate the noise I heard in the library, Father, Jimmy told me who he was to quiet my fright. He showed me a letter, which he had just found on your desk in the library, confessing that you had forged Mr. Clymer's name on the check, and begging Jimmy to conceal your crime, and save Barbara and me from the shame of having you exposed as a forger and a thief." "I never wrote such a letter!" shouted McIntyre, deeply incensed. "No, it was a clever plan," acknowledged Sylvester. "On one of my trips to your house, Colonel McIntyre, I secured wax impressions of your front door lock. I went to your house Monday night and put the letter among your papers just before Turnbull was admitted by your fool of a butler." "And you gave Jimmy Turnbull a dose of poison," charged Kent. But Sylvester, his lips gone dry, raised his manacled hands in protest. "I did not poison him," he cried. "I waited just to see if Turnbull got the letter and to find out what he'd do with the securities, which he had refused to turn over to me. After he had read the forged letter, Mr. Turnbull acted sort of faint and went out in the hall. I could just see him put down a box on the hall table and lean against the wall. Then he went into the dining room and came back a second later, carrying a glass of water, and I saw him take up and open a small box and toss some white pills into his mouth. Then he took a good drink, and picking up a handkerchief lying on the table, he went back into the library." There was silence, as Sylvester's callous recital of the tragedy ended. Helen, her eyes tearless and dark with suffering, sank slowly back in her chair and rested her head against Barbara's sympathetic shoulder. "So Turnbull's death was accidental after all," exclaimed Ferguson. "Or was it suicide?" "Accident," answered Kent. "I found some nitroglycerin pills in the umbrella stand by the hall table." Colonel McIntyre nodded. "Evidently Turnbull put down his pill box before getting a glass of water, and in his attack of giddiness accidentally opened your box of aconitine pills, Mrs. Brewster, instead of his own, and swallowed a fatal dose, thinking they were nitroglycerin." Mrs. Brewster bowed her head in agreement. "That must have been it," she said. "However, I saw Colonel McIntyre tear off the paper wrapping and open my package of pills just before dinner, and when I heard that Jimmy had died from aconitine, I She stammered and stopped short. "You suspected I had murdered him?" asked McIntyre softly. "Yes." She looked appealingly at him. "Forgive me, I should never have suspected you, but the pills, box and all, were missing the next morning from the hall table." "Turnbull must have thrown the box into the umbrella stand," explained Kent. "That was where I found it. Did you get the securities, Sylvester?" turning to the prisoner. "No," sullenly. "She did," and a jerk of his thumb indicated Helen McIntyre. Helen raised her head and addressed them slowly. "Jimmy and I expected Barbara to come in at any moment, and he started to leave when we saw you coming downstairs." She turned to Mrs. Brewster. "Jimmy declared that if we were found together I might be compromised. He couldn't explain his presence without exposing Father. We both thought you a forger, Father.
she interpolated as McIntyre took her hand and pressed it understandingly. So he insisted that I should treat him like an ordinary burglar. We had both forgotten Barbara's silly wager in our horror about Father. Jimmy didn't dare take the securities and Father's confession with him for fear he'd be searched at the police station, and the scandal would have come out then.
True, agreed McIntyre. Go on, Helen.
So Jimmy thrust the securities and Father's confession into an envelope and sealed it with red wax, using Barbara's seal, explained Helen. He hadn't time to write an address or message on it, but he told me to return the envelope to him later in the day, or to give it to Philip Rochester and ask his aid. I brought it here on Wednesday morning, and with Harry's permission, put the envelope in the safe.
I tried to get it from there, volunteered Sylvester, for I overheard Turnbull's plan before I left by the reception-room window.
So it was you and not Mr. Rochester whom I saw steal out of the window, exclaimed Mrs. Brewster.
It's not the first time I've been mistaken for him, explained Sylvester calmly.
Kent started, and gazing at Rochester and the clerk, saw there was a general resemblance in coloring and physique.
Did you present the checks to McDonald at the Metropolis Trust Company, bearing Rochester's and my forged signatures? He asked. I did, acknowledged Sylvester. Mr. Rochester's wardrobe came in very handy for deceiving the casual glance. You know, clothes make the man, and want of it the fellow.
Kent looked up quickly, struck by an idea.
Sylvester, did you steal the envelope containing the securities from me at the Club de Vingt? He asked.
Sylvester shook his head.
No, but she did, pointing to Mrs. Brewster. It's no lie, as McIntyre uttered an indignant denial. When Ferguson left here, carrying off the securities from under my nose almost, I had spent the whole day trying to learn the safe's combination. I trailed him to the Club de Vingt and heard the head waiter tell him you, Mr. Kent, were sitting in the small smoking porch. So I climbed up the trumpet vine. Oh, it was strong, and no climb for one who has done the feats I have in the circus. I reached the porch just in time to see Mrs. Brewster drop her fan, and when the men bent to pick it up, she lifted the envelope and concealed it under her scarf.
Don't. Mrs. Brewster laid a detaining hand on McIntyre as he stepped forward. The man is telling the truth. I thought it was the envelope you gave me earlier in the evening. It was unaddressed, and the red seal was the same.
Just a moment, interrupted Kent. What did you do with the envelope?
When I returned home, I dropped it inside one of the Venetian caskets, Mrs. Brewster replied. No one ever went near them, and I thought it would be safe there. You see, I was puzzled to know how it had disappeared from the desk in the reception room, where I had left it in one of the pigeonholes, intending to take it later to my room.
I took the envelope, your envelope, out of the desk, confessed McIntyre. I would have spoken of it, Margaret, but was hurt that you had left our marriage certificate lying around so carelessly.
Your what? Barbara sprang up, astounded.
Our marriage certificate, repeated McIntyre firmly. Margaret and I were married last week in Baltimore. We would have told you, Helen, but your peculiar conduct and Barbara's so angered me that I forbade Margaret to take you into our confidence.
Father!
Barbara got no further, for Helen had risen. She spoke with quiet dignity.
You forget, Father, that since Monday night we have thought you a forger, and worse, a murderer. Her voice faltered. In our effort to guard you, we have become estranged. Margaret. She held out her hand with an affectionate gesture, and with a sob her stepmother kissed her.
How did this envelope get back inside our safe? Asked Kent a moment later, picking it up and displaying the red seal, intact save for the broken corner.
I went downstairs about midnight or a little later and into the library, confessed Helen. What was my surprise and terror to see Grimes holding the envelope. To me it meant Father's exposure as a forger. I had a revolver in my hand and struck before I thought. Then I must temporarily have lost my reason. It was only my thought to save Father that lent me courage and strength to thrust Grimes inside the casket where Babs and I used to hide. I then returned to my room, and was just coming downstairs again, after secreting the envelope, to release Grimes and get medical assistance if need be, when Margaret's screams aroused the household.
McIntyre interrupted his daughter with a hasty gesture, and addressed his wife. When Detective Ferguson questioned me as to your reason for being in the library, Margaret, I stated you had gone down to get a book left lying on the Venetian casket, he said. I waited for you to volunteer an explanation of your presence there, but you never made any.
I went down to get our marriage certificate. Margaret forgot the presence of others and spoke only to him, the love light in her eyes pleading against the censure she dreaded, as she made her brief confession. Mr. Clymer sent me a note, enclosing a cancelled check, stating the bank officials had decided my signature was a forgery. The check was drawn to Barbara, and on examining it I noticed the peculiar formation of the letter B. It is characteristic of your handwriting and Helen's. She paused and added, I was at a loss what to think. I knew you and Helen wrote alike. Helen's extraordinary behavior to me led me to believe that perhaps she had been short of funds and forged my name to a check in desperation. Then I remembered seeing you, Charles, open the box containing my aconitine pills. The box's disappearance, and Jimmy's death from that poison. She raised her hands in an expressive gesture. Although my reason told me that you might be guilty, my loyalty and love refuted the accusation. Margaret! McIntyre's voice shook with emotion. Then, controlling himself, he turned to Sylvester. I presume this check was some more of your deviltry? Helen answered for the clerk. Removing a soiled paper from her bag, she laid it on Kent's desk. This note was handed to me by Grimes, she explained. It reads, Helen, please cash this check and give money to Mrs. Brewster's dressmaker, Father. I followed the instructions. And gave the money to my sister. Sylvester chuckled at their surprise. My sister was taught in a French convent, and she is an excellent seamstress, when she isn't drunk, as Mrs. McIntyre knows.
See here, Sylvester.
Clymer broke his long silence.
You were in the police court on a charge of assault and battery brought by your wife on Tuesday morning, and you were in the prisoner's cage at the moment Turnbull died. How then was it possible for you to be at the McIntyres at midnight on Monday?
I was out on bail and appeared in the courtroom just in time for my trial, Sylvester explained. I did not have to sit in the cage, but recognizing Turnbull, I went there to be with him. Kent placed the forged check bearing Margaret Brewster's signature on the desk. I take it this check is your work, Sylvester, he said. You reaped the benefit of having the money paid to your sister. Did you also have the fake telegram delivered to me stating Mr. Rochester was in Cleveland? I faked that, broke in Rochester, before the clerk could make a disclaimer. I thought it best to disappear for a few days down in Virginia, where I could think things over in peace. So it was you, Sylvester, and not Mr. Rochester, whom I encountered in his apartment, exclaimed Kent. How did you get in the apartment? From the fire escape and along the window ledge to the bathroom window. Sylvester hitched his shoulders. It was nothing for a man of my agility. Ferguson eyed him with doubtful respect. You have courage, he admitted grudgingly. Come, we must get to headquarters. And he aided Sylvester to his feet. But once standing, Sylvester refused to move. Instead, he turned to Helen. What was that you passed to Mr. Rochester in the police court, and he later gave to Mr. Turnbull? He asked. Oh, don't deny it. I saw you palm a note, Mr. Rochester, from the young lady. There is nothing now to conceal, declared Helen. After Orion and Jimmy left the house for the police station, I grew fearful that Jimmy might overtax his strength in carrying out the farce of his arrest. So as soon as I could, I telephoned to Philip to meet me at the police court and to bring some amyl nitrite capsules with him. And the note, Sylvester, which you saw Miss McIntyre give me in court, concluded Rochester, as Helen paused, told me to hand the capsules to the burglar and to defend him in court. I did both, although badly puzzled by the request. Rochester hesitated. I carried out your wishes, Helen, without question, but when the burglar's identity was revealed, I jumped to the conclusion that you had used me as an instrument to kill him, for I knew something of the effects of amyl nitrite. Great heavens! Exclaimed Helen, aghast. Rochester looked at her and bit his lip. He knew of her affection for Jimmy and her attachment to his memory, but he could not kill the hope that when time had healed the loss, his devotion might some day win her for his own. I did you a great injustice, he admitted humbly, but I was fearfully shocked by the scene. I strove to divert suspicion by insisting that Jimmy died from angina pectoris, and then you came, Helen, and demanded an autopsy. I had to, Helen broke in. I could not believe that Jimmy's death was due to natural causes. Her voice quivered. He had been so loyal, so faithful. I could not be less true to him, even if, as I feared, my own dear father was guilty of the crime. Kent turned and faced Sylvester, who had made a few shuffling steps toward the door. You have done incalculable harm by your criminal acts, he said sternly. But for your lying and trickery, Jimmy Turnbull would be alive today. I trust the court will give you the maximum sentence." Sylvester eyed him insolently. "I've had a run for my money, and I stood to win large sums if things had only gone right," he announced, then addressed Helen directly. "What did you do with the securities?" "I put the envelope back in the open safe when I was here early this afternoon," she explained. An oath ripped from Sylvester. "I mistook you for your sister," he snarled. "Had I known it was you, I'd have wrung the securities from you." Helen stared at his suddenly contorted face. "Ah, you are the man who looked in at the window of the reception room yesterday morning when I was talking to Mr. Kent," she cried. "I recognize you now." He continued to glare at her. "I also sent you a note by your sister outside the Café St. Mark's to secrete the letter B." His voice rose almost into a shout in his ungovernable rage. "I heard Turnbull tell you to take the envelope to Rochester, and I banked on your bringing it here or to his apartment. Damn you, you've thwarted me at every turn." Rochester's powerful hand was clamped across his mouth with such force that the clerk staggered against Ferguson. "Here you, out you go." The detective shoved the struggling man toward the door leading into the corridor, and Clymer sprang to his assistance. A second later Rochester closed the door on their receding figures and found Helen standing by his elbow. "I must go," she said, turning back to look at her father and his bride. "Wait a minute." Kent held up an envelope with its fateful red seal. "This was delivered empty at Rochester's apartment last night. It is addressed to him. Who wrote it?" "I did," exclaimed Mrs. McIntyre. "I felt I must consult either you, Mr. Kent, or Mr. Rochester. So I sent the note to his apartment, but the messenger boy hurried me, and it was not until hours later that I found the note lying on the desk in the reception room and realized I had sent an empty envelope." "I see." Kent held up another envelope, the red seal broken at the corner. "This is yours, Helen." Helen hesitated perceptibly before taking the envelope and tearing it open. She handed the securities to her father. "Here is father's forged confession," she said as she took the remaining paper from the envelope. "It is a marvelous imitation of my handwriting," declared McIntyre, looking at it carefully. Then tearing it into tiny bits, he flung them into the scrap basket and pocketed the securities. "And to think that I aided Sylvester's plot to gain the securities by engaging him as our clerk," groaned Rochester. "It was clever of him to seek employment here," agreed Kent. "But like many crooks, he overreached himself through overconfidence. Must you go, Colonel McIntyre?" "Yes." McIntyre walked over to Helen. "My dear little girl," he began, and his voice was husky with feeling. "How can I show my appreciation of your loyalty to me?" "By being kind to Harry and Barbara." Helen smiled bravely, although her lips were trembling, and for a moment she could not trust herself to speak. "My romance is over. Barbara's is just beginning. And father, will you and Margaret come home with me? I am so lonely." Then turning blindly away, she fairly ran out of the office. "Go with her," said Rochester, a trifle unsteadily. "It has been a terrible ordeal. God help her to forget." His voice failed, and he swept his hand across his eyes as he held open the door into the corridor and followed McIntyre and his wife outside. Kent turned impulsively to Barbara, and his arms closed around her as she raised her eyes to meet his, for she knew that the promise they spoke would be loyally fulfilled, and that her haven of love and happiness was reached at last. End of chapter 21. End of The Red Seal by Natalie Sumner Lincoln.